Next up, we have the year-end appropriations, second reading, and it's been updated.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of council. My name is Chris Cullinan. I'm the city's Director of Finance. This agenda item is a public hearing and second reading of the fiscal year 2019 year-end appropriation. The city's general fund ended FY19 with an unallocated surplus of $5.8 million. At your January 22nd meeting, staff made a series of recommendations regarding the use of these funds. After some discussion, council did not make any amendments to the proposed appropriations, and this item was moved to public hearing and second reading. Subsequently, during your retreat on January 23rd, it was the consensus of council for some additional uses of the surplus funds and changing some of the amounts to be transferred to the citywide reserve and CIP contingency. And so what you see up on the screen here is an attempt to summarize the recommendations at first reading, which you see there in the column on the left of those three. Subsequent amendments, which there seemed to be a consensus of council, with the little letters next to it. Amendment A, allocating $300,000 to the Council Strategic Reserve Equity Fund. Amendment B, allocating $130,000 to the Emergency Assistance Program Support account. C, reducing the transfer to the CIP contingency from the first reading amount of roughly $625,000 down to $500,000. And then finally, Amendment D, reducing the allocation to the citywide reserve rate replacement as needed to balance those first three items, which resulted in it being reduced from $614,000 down to $308,766. So tonight, staff is recommending council take the following actions, and Mr. Blair will correct me if I go astray here. But first, make a motion to amend the first reading of the appropriation to reflect the four changes listed above and agreed to during the budget retreat on January 23rd. Second, and vote on those amendments. 2, conduct a public hearing on the amended year-end appropriation, which would be the first reading with those amendments included, so it would be the revised total there on the left side. And then finally, vote to adopt the FY19 year-end appropriation on second reading.
Correct.
Very good. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay. Are there any questions from council members? All right, so I'm going to open the public hearing.
We have to do the motion first.
Okay. All right. Is there a motion?
I so move.
No.
Motion to amend the first reading of the appropriation to reflect the four changes discussed and agreed to during the budget retreat on January 23rd, 2020.
Is there a second?
Second.
And we vote on. Okay. All right,
Is
please
there any
vote.
discussion? I guess
Any
other
further discussion?
Madam Mayor, a couple points of discussion. First of all, I'm a little bit puzzled at the expression that we agreed at the meeting. I think that, I'll be frank to say that I thought, sort of looking around, that there were three heads that were nodding at the same time, but there was not particularly, in one respect, I don't remember there having been any formal expression of an agreement. And the specific point that I want to draw attention to is the $130,000 for the Emergency Assistance Program support. That's a program that we have allocated $84,516 to for the last at least 4 years or so that I could find in the budget. It's $84,516 in this year's budget, and here we are almost 2/3 of the way through the budget year, and we're apparently intending to add $130,000 to a fund that is only $84,000 a year at the moment. And I would suggest, number one, that is not a wise use of end-of-the-year funds which have not historically been added to ongoing programs, at least not without a request from the staff to do so. And it's important to note that we don't even have a request from the staff to do so in this case. And so number one, I'm concerned that it is not wise budgeting practice to be taking end of the year funds and putting them into operating accounts. And number two, particularly where there has not been a request to do so by the staff. And number three, where there has been articulated by the staff, by the city manager, a rationale for building back up the reserve. So that's my comment. I am not in favor of the $130,000 for those reasons. The other changes I don't really have a problem with.
I would just, my recollection of the meeting is we did have this discussion and you raised similar concerns, and we took a poll of 4-1 interest in making these changes. I would just want to raise that. I hear those concerns. I do support these requests as is, including the $130,000 to the Emergency Assistance Program support, with my understanding that with information from staff, in part the level of unmet funding needs for this program that currently exists and the amount of requests that have not been able to be funded and have been unmet, I think warrants allocating the surplus in that way, because for those individuals seeking assistance from the funds, that level of unmet need represents folks who will face eviction, homelessness, food insecurity, or other issues because of that unmet funding need. Although I do hope that in addition to this, we can have a discussion during the budget cycle as it moves forward about is there a way to increase funding for this program in a more sustainable way, and look at what the level of need is for this fund. But it's my view that we can do both.
And I would just say that during the retreat, I did express that, I was comfortable with some amounts. I would say that the 130 was what was giving me pause, because it did seem like it was just a way that we were balancing things. And there are a lot of needs that we have that have been brought to our attention that we could be using these dollars for. And I do also share a pause that we are using dollars that would go towards an operational account. At the same time, I did agree, and I said that I could see us putting some amount of money towards this account, and there was certainly the three folks in support of this amount being the amount.
And first, I'll just share that staff did make a presentation. Part of that presentation, and I don't have that report up in front of me, but was that in the 4-month period, I think from August to December, that the request for that funding was $182,000, and they only had $25,000, which is what they allocated per quarter to try to make the almost $85,000 last. We funded as a community, and through the work of Reg Schuyler, I think 3 now Orange Dot reports. Early in Orange Dot 3.0, it says there are 63,581 families in the Charlottesville region. Of these, 12,024 families, 19%, do not make enough money to afford the essentials of life, food, shelter, clothing, utilities, and the added costs associating with working, childcare, transportation costs. As detailed in the sections that follow, families in our community generally need to earn $35,000 annually to meet their basic needs. Then it goes through how many families that we have living under poverty. We do this, get this information when we get the information about CHAP also. And I think when we're talking about everything from where we allocate taxpayers' funding to what developments happen in the area to whether or not there is a possibility of undoing some of the effects of poverty, generational poverty has had on a lot of our families. I'll also remind you that in that report that I don't have in front of me, that there were requests to help pay rent up to the $85,000 mark. So not only are low-income family members in our community struggling, and it's not just black and brown low-income family members, because a lot of times when people hear poverty, they see black faces, brown faces, and forget about the massive numbers of low-income and white individuals in this community that are struggling. So while only $84,000 has been allocated in the past, it's not because the need is not great. It is because the advocacy has not been there, and I don't think anything from the staff presentation had us come up with the end result that the money is not needed.
I'm sorry.
Staff did not say the money was not needed. When you don't maybe believe, and I don't want to speak for staff, but when there hasn't been the advocacy for something and the amount have been pretty stable, when the need is so great, with a staff member who works in human services serving people, that probably means more that they could not receive the funding versus there was not a need for the funding. So the advocacy on staff part and what they can advocate for is really different from what council members can advocate for, and we don't have the restrictions that they may have, and just to keep that in mind.
I think, to be fair, the report that you referred to, the staff report, was presented to us by a letter or by an email from you reporting on what someone had given to you privately, and then you forwarded on to us. So it's not as though staff stood up here in front of us 2 weeks ago and asked for this.
Khaki Dimick, the Director of Human Services, gave us that same information.
But she gave you that information,
No,
which
she
you
presented.
gave to us.
I did. That did happen that way too, which it was factual information, so I don't know why that's being questioned.
Only
But
because the question is, when you say staff requested it, or staff proposed it,
I didn't say
or staff
requested.
reported on it.
She
that-
did.
To you individually.
No, she gave all of us a report. Was
next-
Khaki not in?
Couple days later.
After the meeting. yeah.
Couple days later.
Yes. So you now received the information from her too. And you received the same information that I received from her. I didn't doctor the information in any way. So the issue is that there are families who are struggling that need assistance, and we can help provide some of that assistance to our struggling families.
And on that logic, there is effectively no limit to what we should be putting into this fund.
Well, when you can look a family in the face that can't meet their basic needs for a variety of reasons, and if you have the potential to say that you thought replenishing a reserve that was already dollars allocated for expenses such as radio replacement is more important than helping families meet their basic needs, then I guess that's your position, it's just not mine.
I'm simply an advocate for using the budgetary practices that we have used for many years. At the end of the year, money is not to go to operating expenses. So we've had the discussion. I've got nothing more to say.
That's also not true. I had this Facebook conversation with former council member who didn't think that it was appropriate to advocate for compensation for staff. And in the 2016 surplus, that part of that surplus was used to raise wages, salaries for fire and police officers. So that is also inaccurate information, and one of the people that voted on that, I had to send her a reminder to. So you may want to look at
Was that
some of that
at the
information.
request of the city manager, or the request of the staff?
You would have to go back and look. I don't have that information.
Okay.
The point for me for that was that someone was saying that it was inappropriate use of funds to use it towards compensation, and it was something that they had voted on in the past. But I think people who voted for me wanted me to advocate. And so I don't know what the intentions is for other people. But every year since I've been here, and even before I was on council, we've been able to make recommendations that we discuss as a council. And so there shouldn't be an issue with council members being able to recommend for consideration funding for surplus or any other dollars. Any other questions or comments? All right, so we're now public hearing.
No, actually, that was the discussion for the amendment. There still needs to be a
Be a
vote on the
vote, okay.
amendment, and then the public.
All right, it's been a long. All right, so there was a motion and a second.
Yes.
All right, so please vote. All right, that carries 4-1. And so now we're opening up the public hearing. Is there any, oh, wait, I have a list. So we have one person signed up, Tom Gallagher.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Tom Gallagher. I live at 1920 Barracks Road in the city. Okay, so I have a slightly different suggestion of what you do with this surplus, since I first read about it this morning in the paper. And that is to simply carry it forward to next year and consider with a little bit more deliberation what you're going to do with it. In addition to providing an opportunity to consider it more carefully, it's perhaps useful to ask why there is this surplus. And in my humble opinion, partially this is a result of the large tax increase passed last year by last year's city council, which is, as you probably all remember, is 7.8%. I mean, let me just remind, as Dr. Richardson has pointed out, the tax rate was not changed. And so if the assessments go up by 7.8% and you don't change the rate, you've therefore raised the taxes by 7.8%. So carrying the money forward might somewhat lower the probability of having a similar event happen this year. As pointed out earlier, the rising taxes are slowly driving people, especially ones who are retired and on fixed incomes, out of the city. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
Good evening, Nancy Carpenter, city resident. I'm here speaking in favor of item 13, the emergency assistance program support of additional $130,000 to try and spend between now and the end of the fiscal year. I'm very well aware of that program support fund because I actually happen to administer it for the city. So I'm very well aware of who's calling us, what they're saying, how often they cry on my shoulder, how often I have to go outside and take a breath of air. We're now probably servicing about 10 people per month in the city for help. Now, what this $130,000 will help with is a collaborative situation with AIM. AIM right now is and you spoke very highly of AIM at the last meeting, I think very highly of that program. They are helping people in Albemarle County and the city of Charlottesville. With this additional money to the city of Charlottesville, AIM can concentrate more on Albemarle County because the county has not seen it in the light of day to have an emergency assistance fund at this time. And you say nobody has been here advocating for more money than the $84,000. A couple of times I've been here in front of this board at some capacity, other components of the board asking for some additional monies for this. I know that I have helped people get their cars fixed when they don't live on a bus line, and that is the only car they have to get back and forth to work. I know that I have helped somebody who has had past due rent because they've been sick in the hospital for 2 weeks, and they don't have adequate sick time to be able to make up for that income, and they need some help. I've helped people that have lost jobs because businesses have just all of a sudden closed up and they need help. Now, will that additional money give me more gray hairs? Well, sure it will, but you know what? I don't care. I want families to be housed. I want people to have their cars in operating order. If they need a medical expense paid, I want that done. That is what good government does. It takes care of people. And just because it's, a late ad, let's do that. We know that this is what's going to be needed. We know that the federal government is going to be creating budgets that are going to decrease the amount of money to human services in all areas that we're living. I mean, at some point, I imagine if Medicaid gets cut, somebody's got to figure out who's going to take care of Meemaw when her Medicaid bed is taken away and a 2-income family goes down to a 1-income family. And our city's going to have to step in and help that pain. The other thing with that emergency assistance fund is that it's at 200% of area median income. So it gets a little bit higher, a little bit deeper in our working class people and people who are on benefits or on limited incomes. So this back and forth that I've seen angers me a lot because I work with these folks every damn day. And I go home, you know, very stressed because I can't help everybody that needs help. And this will absolutely double the number we could help in 1 year. So thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak? No? Okay. So closing the public hearing. Is there a motion? Do we have to do?
You would need a motion to adopt the appropriation as amended.
Yeah.
I make a motion to adopt the appropriation as amended.
Second? Is there a second? I'm not saying.
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion? And just a quick, since Ms. Dimick is in the room, the unintended consequences of the increase, I wonder, is that something that we can, Ms. Carpenter just talked about AIM concentrating funding. I don't know what that amount is. If there's any way to track that, but it would be helpful to know, you know, how many dollars they may usually spend on city residents that may be directed just to the county because of this increase in funding.
Sure, we can start to track that. I suspect it's already being tracked by AIM, and we work collaboratively with them on this project, so I'm sure we could collect that data. We can look historically and then look prospectively for the next 6 months.
So you are saying that there is an impact that by us giving more money, it might mean that they will not going to support us to the same level that they do as a
No,
city?
I think actually Ms. Carpenter was just suggesting that was one thing one consequence that could happen, that they could move their money into. They haven't had a conversation with AIM about what would happen if we got additional dollars. I think everyone would celebrate the additional dollars, regardless of any changes in the existing pool. We have right now, without making any changes, we have a large unmet need every single month, and so I think even with no changes, we would be probably maxing out on those dollars.
I'm just
anyway.
getting at, like, I would
Yeah.
like to have the county have a reason to believe too, and to step up.
Absolutely. I think, you know, I know that the County Department of Social Services has a number of privately funded pools of accessible dollars for folks who are clients of DSS, but I don't know if there's any source outside of AIM you know, working through the homeless system of care for folks who are experiencing an emergency crisis in Albemarle.
Any other questions?
And it's not a question, but a comment. I just hope during the budget process, we're also able to have a conversation about what an appropriate level of funding for this program would be on an annual basis, because this is obviously a one-time expenditure, but it's a permanent need. So,
Thank you. All right, so any further discussion? All right, so please vote on the year-end appropriation as amended.
yes.
All right, that carries 5-0. Thank you. Next, we have establishing new form-based zoning regulations, first of 2 readings.
Sir.
Madam Mayor and members of council, before Mr. Haluska provides his presentation, I know you've received a number of emails in the past week about the form-based code and procedure. Just wanted to walk you very briefly through that. As you recall, You had a joint public hearing with the Planning Commission. There was an ordinance and a map in front of, well, not, I should say zoning text amendment and a zoning map amendment in front of you. Planning Commission did not make a recommendation. They did provide a list of 14 points for your consideration. But again, procedurally, that zoning map amendment and that zoning text amendment, that is what is before you. It has not been amended based on the Planning Commission comments, but I think Mr. Haluska will address those comments.
Madam Mayor, members of council, Brian Haluska, Principal Planner with the Department of Neighborhood Development Services. Talking to you about the SIA plan. So a quick background of this item, just to kind of rehash the history of it. The city in 2012 identified an area of the city where they were focusing a small area planning process. We contracted with Cunningham Quill Architects to guide that planning process, and ultimately they delivered a draft of what we call the Strategic Investment Area, or SIA plan, to the city in 2013. City Council in 2014 agreed to amend the comprehensive plan to add that plan into the city's comprehensive plan, so it is a part of the comprehensive plan. Subsequently, the city engaged another consultant, this time the Form-Based Code Institute, to draft a form-based code as a part of one of the, in compliance with one of the recommendations of the SIA plan. If you go through the SIA plan, a long list of recommendations. The form-based code is one piece of that. This form-based code does not cover the entire SIA. It covers what we consider phase one, which is primarily made up of areas zoned downtown extended, although there are a few pieces here and there zoned with other zoning districts. In the memo in front of you is a list of all of the public engagement that was done as a part of this, starting in 2016 and early 2017 with the contract procurement. And it ultimately came before you in November at a joint public hearing, and again in January at another joint public hearing. Planning Commission, in fulfilling their charge from council, has given you a report on the draft. They don't have to recommend on zoning matters. So they gave you a list of 9 text-related concerns and 5 map-related concerns that are on pages, I believe, 4 and 5 of your memo. Staff's kind of intent with this item is to get the council's feedback on these proposed changes before updating that draft. So the draft in front of you has not been modified, but I think everyone involved in this would like some idea of what council's will is on each of these items, and then hopefully we can bring forward a draft that addresses them all and tightens up a few other items out there. One item that's not on this list, staff did meet with representatives of the Southern Environmental Law Center. They do have a couple of open space related concerns that they've articulated to me. Staff's in agreement to make those changes, so we do have those as well. I'm not going to read the 14 points, but I will, if you do have questions related to any of those, I'm happy to answer them. That's all I have.
Mayor Walker, can I ask a question? Related to those 14 points, are there any that you have concern over what the Planning Commission's recommended?
I don't believe so. I think some of these are very easy fixes, including, one suggestion from the Planning Commission that I think clears up a lot of the affordable housing bonus issues is to move from a unit-based bonus to a square footage bonus. That one was kind of a pretty simple one to make. The only one I would kind of, we'd probably want a little more clarity on, and we may have to work with representatives from the Hebrew Cemetery about the zoning of that. That's a little more complex because of the zoning designation. We can certainly put a buffer. I think we can add a buffer into this, but I want to make sure that their expectations about the current zoning allows 9-story buildings adjacent to the cemetery. So I think there needs to be further discussion with them about the zoning of their property as well as the adjacent properties and what we can and can't do in this code, but also with theirs. Their property is not included in the SIA, so we can't touch it with this change without doing a re-advertisement and a new public hearing, but we certainly welcome the opportunity to discuss it further with them. Regardless of what we do here, I think there's more discussion to be had and more protections we can look at.
And you've obviously looked at a lot of public comment that's come through, and I guess how do you how you'll consider some of those other comments? Because I guess just where I'm coming from, and I have talked to some of my colleagues, I guess all of them, but just, I'd like us to say, like, let's agree if there's anything among a council, if we have any, objection to anything that has been identified by the planning commission, and if not, let's direct you to move forward on those changes. But I also feel like there's been some meaningful feedback coming from the public that I want us to weigh in on. At the same time, I don't know that we're the body of five to decipher between this comment versus this. Southern Environmental Law Center is one perfect example of one that I really kind of resonated with me that we need to be considering. There's obviously things coming from the preservation group, which I think actually Planning Commission has addressed with some of the streets
They did.
that weren't there. And also Ms. Robertson, when I asked her about some questions last week, indicated that when we think about the map, that map is something that actually is much more fluid than the ordinance itself. So as we want to consider properties down the road that may fall into a different transition zone, that those are things that we can revisit down the road as well. So I'm just trying to also decipher what are we locking into and what are we not. And obviously tonight we're not locking into anything.
Right.
But I want us to give you the direction that you need. And she said it might take as much, about 60 days really was like a realistic time frame that she said for you to really consider all the meaningful feed that's coming in and then also what's coming from the Planning Commission.
Yeah, I think the one thing that would really help from the city council is to give us, if there are changes to the map that you do want to see us include in the next draft, I think it would help to know those, because those potentially have to be re-advertised.
Okay.
Because, once any map changes, we need to, and we've advertised them in a certain manner, so we'll have to review whether or not they need to be re-advertised in a new public hearing done by the commission. So that would certainly be helpful, but yes, what Ms. Robertson said is I agree wholeheartedly with her. The map is not, the process which we're going under to change the text and the map, we can easily go through it again. In fact, we're often bringing housekeeping measures with the zoning ordinance to you because we've discovered something, in an ordinance passed 10 years ago that we need updated or modified.
And maybe I misunderstood, but I think it was almost like we could separate these two things. There's the ordinance, which obviously is the text, but that maybe that the actual map itself might justify having some charrettes where we have a chance to really kind of get into that in a much more greater level. I'm not saying us doing that, but is there a group of folks in the public interaction just to focus on the map itself, us knowing that we're moving forward with an ordinance? And so I'm just trying to understand what flexibility.
Would have Mr. Blair weigh in on separating the two and how that might be accomplished.
Yeah, I think I would advise, if that's the council's prerogative, I would not adopt the zoning text separate from the map, because the zoning text sets the districts and sets everything that can occur in the districts. But if no districts exist, sort of the chicken and egg.
Yeah,
So I think while you can do that, that's fine. I would think you would want to have a map that the zoning text would apply to.
Because it seems like the feedback that I've heard from others talking about this is just the map seems to be where some of the, I mean, it's more clear the direction we're getting on the overall ordinance, but the map itself is where things kind of get tricky.
If I may, what we could do is work on the text. And again, you don't have to enact the text, but bring it back to council and say, we've made changes based on all the comments to this point. And obviously, the map process can simultaneously be occurring that you're talking about. And then ultimately, you would have one ordinance to adopt both at the same time. Because again, I don't think you would adopt text without a map that it would apply to.
Yeah, okay.
So if we, in the past, I've stated also that I believe that this just needed to be looked at in terms of a holistic process. So I'm really interested in the consultants that we're paying, $1 million or so to, what their thoughts are about when this should be adopted, where this fits in, and for us to not prolong that process either, but for us to look at this along with the, form-based code, along with the comprehensive plan housing strategy, and allow the individuals that we're paying to kind of guide this process to place this where it should go in that context. I don't think we should be doing separate processes because it's not serving us well at all. And so though that's still those are still my thoughts about it. I asked earlier if this process is going to take 2 years, is there any part of it that will be complete before then? And not to rush them, because of course we want it done well, but I just think that they should be able to review and provide some, outside input into this.
But I still think there's a good effort into having staff at least get this to a level that when we hand it to the consultant to review, it's kind of a more finished product, because right now it just seems like if we were to give them what we have right now, there's clearly a lot of loose ends. And so just for clarity for the consultant, I think it's still worth the effort of staff to kind of go through this level of modification. Does that make sense?
And part of this could be, again, staff works on the ZTA, the text, and talks to the consultant and brings back a report to council as the map review process takes place.
But we need,
I have no idea why my computer is suddenly making noise.
let's see. So we need to make the decision whether we're asking them to come back to us with an update in 60 days, or are we asking them to update it to give the information to the consultants, or neither?
Well, what I think would be possible is, based on the direction, we could make the ZTA changes as a staff, present them to the consultant, get their feedback, and come back to you with a report that
Okay,
includes both the updated ordinance and the consultant's thoughts.
okay,
In 60 days?
Maybe not.
maybe not.
We do have I know we do have a phone meeting with the portion of the consultant team that's working specifically on the zoning ordinance
Okay.
this week.
Okay.
So that can be a bullet point in that agenda to kind of say we have a draft, and we can explain where we are. I think we can give them the draft now. They're, these guys write code, so that's, they're used to seeing these types of things, and we can kind of just say, when it's changed, we will send it to you. We want you to be apprised of it, and here's kind of the expectation. Any feedback that you have, we'd like to hear it. One observation, I know that Mr. Blair and I were chatting on the mall this morning, is that there may be aspects of this code that they want to move into more, use more frequently throughout our entire zoning ordinance, particularly if they're looking at a complete redraft of it. The more consistency we have across zoning districts, the easier it is for staff to administer that code.
And similarly, how will the other small area plans that have been adopted be part of that process? Sorry, it's a little bit.
I think
tangential.
I think the process is to look at everything. So, one of the bullet points of the city staff, at least in kind of our preliminary discussions amongst ourselves, is we do think there needs to be some simplification of our code. Our code's very tough to read. It's very tough even for those of us that are professionals in it to kind of sift through. So one of the guidelines is we'd like to make it more publicly just accessible and easy for people to read and understand. The more individualized zonings we have, the more complex it gets in terms of how it administers. Any small area plan that's been completed, anything that's out there, any recommendations, certainly they will have access to those. And those plans can continue along their process, but I think how we set up the zoning in the future, we're going to need to try to make as much standardization as possible. Fewer zones would be nice, particularly mixed-use zones. So those are some ideas that we have out there, and they'll certainly be working in the context of the overall review of the comp plan and the zoning ordinance.
So the consultant recommendations, they will be making them based on what they feel are best practices, and not based on any direction that we're pushing them to.
Well, I think the idea of the RFP at this point, I think, is, initially is the comprehensive plan. And certainly the priorities of the community, the vision of the community will then, that are adopted as a part of that comprehensive plan, then inform your zoning. So you want those two documents to work really well together. You want them to support each other. You want what you're administering in your zoning ordinance, because that's what guides development. That's what determines what's on the ground, to reflect the vision and goals of the community that are in that comprehensive plan. A lot of communities have what we have. They have, a very aspirational comprehensive plan, and then they have a zoning ordinance they haven't touched in 15 years, and the two probably don't mesh in a lot of ways. So our input, the zoning ordinance ought to be what we want as a community.
But you made the statement that there may be aspects of the form-based code that they want to move into other areas. That will be because they think that is best versus that we have already been investing in form-based code and we want them to go that direction.
Yeah, at no point do I want to make it sound like we've given them any kind of do this, do that, do this. We have not had any of those types of discussions. I think the initial discussions with the consultant have very much been about community engagement. That's always the first topic on any of these agendas. So how do we hear from the community? This is our first discussion with the zoning. I mean, they were on the phone in the kickoff meeting and just kind of got the lay of the land. This is our first discussion, and so we kind of want to give them a blank slate and let them do it.
So,
A couple questions. We had public comment tonight about concerns about Oakwood Cemetery and potential impacts on Oakwood Cemetery. In your view, do you think it would be reasonable to incorporate that into the conversation about the impacts about the Hebrew Cemetery, given that they're adjacent? Or is that something that would make sense as part of that conversation as well?
Certainly the impacts on the Hebrew Cemetery are a little more substantive because they are bounded on three sides and there's no intervening right of way. But I think the point is well taken, and I think whatever protections we look at for the Hebrew Cemetery could easily be transferable to the Oakwood Cemetery. Some of that is the zoning of those properties. In some ways, I think Oakwood Cemetery might be better protected now because I believe it's low-density zoning.
Yes.
Or it might be, I guess so.
I think it is.
So it has a level of protection that the Hebrew Cemetery, because it's zoned downtown extended, does not.
All right. And both for myself and the public, could you refresh us on some of the conversation about why the Planning Commission recommended to measure in square footage rather than units for the affordable housing bonus?
There was a concern about the draft as presented by the consultant, because it's based on units, that people could kind of game the system in their bonus floors by doing much larger units than the rest of their building. So, 1 and 2 bedrooms on the by right floors, and then in the bonus floors they're doing 4-bedroom larger units, and then saying, well, I'm going to take the smaller number of units per floor that I've done in my bonus floors and only do 10 or 15% of that. Moving to square footage removes any ability to game the system by putting a bunch of units together behind one door and calling it one unit as opposed to like 3 or 4.
And another question. I know one of the concerns the Planning Commission had, and I've had myself in terms of reviewing the current text of this draft of the form-based code and evaluating its previous drafts, is there's no sort of red line document outlining the changes. Is the consultant that wrote this form-based code, do we have any contact with them anymore, given that the contract is finished in terms of resolving things like that, or are they sort of done in terms of their communication with us?
They are done working on the application. The red line, we could certainly produce it from the November one. I'd rather base it on the December draft, partly because, or the January draft, partly because there is actually, after the fact, at the request of Ms. Long, I created a red line and put it out. It's about the length of the two documents put together because there were a lot of changes between the two drafts, so it's over 100 pages long. Right. We could certainly provide that to anyone, but we also can do the red line off of this. This draft is ours. We're the ones managing it. We have control over it. And so, yeah.
And in addition, one of the map-related concerns is the impact of T6 zone properties looming over CRHA properties should be reviewed. what does that specifically entail, and is that something you would like direction from council on with more specificity about that impact on CRHA properties?
I think, yeah, I think it would help to know where council feels about that. And I think the concern is specifically the 6th Street property and its border with the Ix property. And I think that could easily, there are some buffer type work that needs to be done along property lines, particularly maybe just single-use residential properties where we could say there needs to be a 20-foot setback or a bulk plane line or something like that. We actually have some of those in other districts that we could probably easily borrow.
And finally, should council give you direction on some of these points outlined in the Planning Commission's report? I'm unclear about what the next steps are in terms of how unique the situation was of the Planning Commission not making a recommendation one way or the other. Is the goal, once we give direction on these things, for it to go back to the Planning Commission and then return to us at a later date? I'm just not sure what this process is.
Well, I think, again, to the point about the variance, bad pun for a zoning text amendment, right? But the variance between a ZTA and a ZMA, staff can work on getting the 9 points you have before you about the text, getting that in an ordinance, and again, to Mayor Walker's concern, consulting with the comprehensive plan consultants about, and the zoning ordinance consultants about how this will fit in the ultimate framework. I think in terms of the map-related concerns, though, they're probably, depending on what you add, what you take out, we would have to re-advertise and go back to the Planning Commission, get a new recommendation, and then have the council hear it again. I think, because it's so property-specific in advertisement, and when you change properties and zoning designations, I think that's usually going to be a tripwire to re-advertise.
But we can at least the map-related concerns can be addressed in the short term because they've been identified by the Planning Commission unless we have an objection to any of those. They could be working on those as a starting point.
They certainly can, yes.
I wouldn't want to go back to the Planning Commission and not have it address their concerns.
Right.
Okay.
So at a later date, even with these texts, we could send it back to the Planning Commission with their text amendments changed if we are still looking at map amendments and not quite clear on those and want to send it back after staff has done some more work in the next 90 days or whatever.
Right. I think, again, what I'm hoping is that there can be a report back to council just on, here is the proposed zoning text amendment and the report from the comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance consultant. And again, these can be on 2 tracks. The map work, possible map amendments to this ZMA can be going on. What I think would be ideal at that point is probably to take the zoning ordinance as amended. I'm going to assume, that can be dangerous sometimes, but I'll assume there will probably be some adjustments in the map as well. T4, T5, T6, maybe taking Grave Street out. I know that's come up. And then we would have, based on the council's feedback with the report, we'd probably take the zoning text amendment, the zoning map amendment at the Planning Commission at the same time for a public hearing with council, and then it would come back to you.
Is this enough direction?
Are there any,
So-
are there any of the
Right.
14 points you have, are there any that you object to?
Yeah.
I get the impression that you're in support of them all at this point, so if I'm wrong, let me know. Include something you don't want to see.
There's none that I object to, just a question of whether any could be fleshed out further, but there's none I object to.
I would agree with that.
It's a long debate with them. We lived through it, so. It was a long process with them, which some of us lived through, so. want to support it, yeah. So we don't need to take any, we don't need to do any.
I think I would ask if somebody could just make a motion to defer this item until a report is brought back to council, just to have an official action.
Move to defer this item until it's brought back to council for an official action.
Second?
All right, any further discussion?
I don't, again, I think, maybe when we hear feedback from the consultant, maybe it will address a lot of these concerns, but sort of zooming out at a higher level, I just have a lot of concerns about the future of this proposal, considering the uniqueness of how it was presented to us by the Planning Commission, the relative lack of information I feel like I have, and a lot of open-ended questions I have in terms of the effectiveness of the height bonus, how that could interact with changes in state law related to density bonuses this General Assembly session, a deeper analysis of the impact on affordable housing from the HAC. Maybe the consultant can perform that function. So at a higher level, I just have a lot of concerns about the future of this process, about how we're going to make a final decision one way or another on it.
And that was one of the consultant meeting that we had last fall. Was it August, September?
I think it was September.
September, yeah, one of those months. But that was one of the questions that I asked about the affordable housing. What would it bring? And that was when we received the answer that over a 20-year period, maybe 98 units, right? It was very questionable, like how this would not be very beneficial to helping us meet our affordable housing needs. I am trying to pay very close attention. This is not an area that, I'm strong in, but what I do know is that there are some things that we should probably take a look at, and because a lot of the developers had issues with some of the provisions in it. So I've been paying very close attention to them and their comments, and how that could, later benefit and impact, and there'll be things that I'll be paying attention to during the comprehensive plan discussion. But I just don't know if this is the avenue for me. I haven't seen anything that makes me think that I would, be comfortable voting on this outside of the work that the consultants are being hired to do. So
And I share that concern as well, and would find it maybe helpful to just have more information. And maybe, this process that we're doing will present this information anyway, but more information from the Planning Commission, the HAC, the consultant, trying to pull out some of what are maybe some good things in it, or what are problems with it in terms of like removing density limits or lot sizes that I know were HAC recommendations.
Yeah.
And like you said, to speak bluntly, I'm, seeing letters and lobbying from developers about how much they hate it is a sign that maybe there's things in it that are advancing affordable housing or other goals against their interests. But then trying to separate that out from this as a whole, because I have a lot of questions about the effectiveness as a whole, and just so we can.
yeah, there was a big discussion about the open space requirements, right? That was pretty, interesting, that I would like more clarity on, in broader discussion. So there are definitely, again, I don't know, I don't have enough information, and still after all this time. I think we do need to pay attention to the fact that the directions we pull staff in, how much we ask them to do outside of them trying to get the comprehensive plan housing strategy and assist with the, or the consultants assist them whichever direction it works. So when we're deferring and asking them to bring us back information, I would hope that we're not asking them to do things that would take away from us getting the holistic work done.
And so is the feedback from the consultant on this going to be about how it fits in to the comprehensive plan, or is it going to also include some of their feedback on how it may or may not fit into affordable housing strategy? Like, what sort of feedback are they going to give us on this proposal?
I kind of hear two questions out there. One that I just wrote down is what you mentioned about height bonuses and the ability of that, and we certainly have the services of a zoning expert to kind of chat through. Have they seen this work? Have they not seen it work? Have they seen people try it? Additionally, I think there's just some feedback from them about if they go through this, is this in their kind of initial look at Charlottesville, is this something that is a pattern to be replicated? Is it something that when they look at it, they go, we've seen other communities and we have issues with these types of things, and maybe there's something good, maybe there's something bad. So I definitely hear the concern that you're mentioning, and those will be some points that we'll raise with them this week.
And I do want to add two other points to, I think, all of your concerns. One, coming attraction, as you know, February 20th, we're going to have a work session that's going to focus deeply on affordable housing. So hopefully, I don't know that we'll address this specifically, but that might start to talk to your questions about the density bonus. The second thing, it is worth pointing out that there is current legislation in the General Assembly that if ultimately it's enacted and ultimately the governor signs it, could be a sea change in terms of how we even look at form-based code. I mean, if we are added to 2304, 15.2.2304, that gives this council a smorgasbord of options for affordable housing that are not available right now. And that may completely change how you look at this and how you look at your zoning code and how the consultants look at the zoning code based on the comp plan feedback.
Okay.
So we have to vote.
So we're going to vote.
Vote. And as part of that vote, I know we talked about deferring an action, but could you also refer the map? It seems like you want to refer the map questions back to the Planning Commission as well.
So the amending city official zoning map to define boundaries of the new zoning district.
Right. But that seems what the council wanted, to refer some of the map questions back to the Planning Commission with staff.
Yes.
Is that something that seems reasonable?
Because you said there's no map without text, no text
Right.
without map.
Right.
And they have laid out their concerns, but.
Just to add, part of the reason the action that came before you, the report that came before you from the Planning Commission, was they were under a 100-day
100
deadline.
Right.
They were out of time.
So now we don't have any deadlines, except for we
Yes.
impose on ourselves.
Right, so they could take that. I think they would, based on the discussion they had, I think they would welcome the opportunity to kind of take another pass at
Great.
that. And I know they had a number of properties, so this would open the door not just to, obviously 310 Avon was mentioned tonight, but there were some other properties identified very quickly by the commission that I think if we look at it in a holistic manner, we could potentially come forward with a map that better reflects the will of the commission.
Okay.
So she needs to amend her motion.
I think you can just have an motion to defer action by the council tonight and refer the zoning map amendment back to the Planning Commission for further consideration. Defer.
My motion tonight.
Defer of action by the council tonight.
Defer action by the council tonight and refer the map to the Planning Commission for further amendment.
Right. Refer the ZMA to the Planning Commission.
Refer the ZMA to the Planning Commission.
I'll second that.
All right, any further discussion? All right, please vote. All right, that carries 5-0. Thank you. Next, we have a resolution, comprehensive signage plan for Dairy Central.
Applicant here, but good evening, how are you? This request is for a proposal for a excuse me, comprehensive signage plan for the Dairy Central Phase 1 mixed-use development at 946 Grady Avenue. The signage plan will be applied to all regulated signs for the project. This is a 1.7-acre site, and the existing building, which is the former Monticello Dairy Building, are designated as individually protected property. Therefore, it's subject to BAR review. The Dairy Central project, Phase 1, which is what we're discussing, will adaptively reuse the historic structure that fronts on Grady Avenue and behind it construct a 3-story office and commercial space. Per City Code Section 34-1045, applicants for a development that is subject to a site plan review and design review may request approval of a comprehensive signage plan. Such a plan is defined as a written plan detailing the type, size, quantity, shape, color, location of all signs within the development that is subject of the plan, and where the number of characteristics and/or locations of the signs referenced within the plan do not comply with the requirements of the sign regulations. So, in short, City Council can approve a comprehensive signage plan upon a determination that there is good cause for deviating from the strict application of the requirements and the comprehensive signage plan as proposed will serve the public purposes and objectives at least as well or better than would otherwise be permitted by the regulations. And with the proposed plan for Dairy Central, to be clear, all of the regulated signage will comply with the signage ordinance except for 2 things. One is the addition of 2 monument signs. One is allowed by right per parcel. The applicant is requesting 3 due to the scale of the project. And the second is the area of the cow mural, as we're calling it. We long ago determined that the subject of that mural constituted a sign and would therefore be subject to regulation. And as a sign, the mural area exceeds the size allowed by ordinance. So in short, in looking at this comprehensive signage plan, everything in it is okay with the regs, but they're requesting the plan only because of the 2 additional monument signs and, of course, the cow mural. Approval of the signage aligns with the City Council's vision statement for economic sustainability, which includes the goal of facilitating significant mixed and infill development within the city. As with other projects related to design review, abutting property owners were notified prior to the BAR meeting, and at the November 19th, 2019 BAR meeting, there were no public comments. Approval of this signage plan will have no budgetary impact on the city. And on November 19th, 2019, the BAR reviewed this item and recommended approval by council with 2 conditions. One, that there be no signage on the building higher than the sills of the second floor windows, and second, that the mural that would be the cow mural should not have a faux fading, which would create a false historic narrative. Both have been incorporated into the plan that's before you, and staff recommends approval. So with that, council, tonight you may approve the signage plan as submitted. You can approve the signage plan with modifications or conditions, or you can deny the signage plan. And to be clear, with the denial, the applicant may revise and resubmit, put it back through the process, or they could proceed with the regulated signage on the site being subject to the strict provisions of the signage ordinance. And with that, they would only get 1 monument sign, and the cow sign, however it might be used, could not exceed the 50 square feet area maximum. So I know that was fast, but any questions?
Are there any clarifying questions? Comments?
So you want to make a motion so we can have a discussion if someone wants to discuss?
Okay. Yeah.
I move to approve the Dairy Central Phase 1 comprehensive signage plan dated December 17th, 2019.
Second. Oh, sorry. Rock, paper, scissors.
All right, any further discussion?
Some may know my thoughts on the mural. I will say this is a mural that is facing a neighborhood, facing the 10th and Page neighborhood, one of our historic black neighborhoods, which is facing extreme gentrification pressures. And the Dairy Central project has been, I know, in canvassing and talking to folks in that neighborhood, a significant concern about the impact that that will have on property assessments, the impact it will have on the character of the neighborhood, as well as the kind of jobs and community centers that it is bringing into the neighborhood. We've received multiple emails just today from residents of the 10th and Page neighborhood who thought that the mural didn't fit with their neighborhood and is not something that they would like in their neighborhood. There's some humor to it, but it's a question I ask myself: does this mural go up in North Downtown? I don't think it does. And we've received emails from just now about possible community murals that have been developed that are looking for sites in the city that have not, we haven't found a site to do it. I've had multiple people reach out to me who are interested in trying to partner to create community murals that represent the history of the neighborhood and the residents who currently live there. This is something which is not allowed by right. It's coming for us for approval for a reason, because it's above what is allowed by right. And for that reason, I do not support this mural, and I would hope that for something that is not allowed by right and is coming before us for approval that goes beyond, we can find some way, if it's going above what's allowed by right, for us to approve it, to try to involve some kind of community participation that produces art that matches the history and the community of the neighborhood. So that's my thoughts.
And that's consistent, conversation that we're having. The mural that went up on 600 West Main, it was the same, conversation. So again, once the buildings are owned and the community where there's a lot of outreach, because that's one of the things that to Chris Henry's credit that he attempted to do was to get a lot of outreach. This is one of the areas where I would have, even though I haven't voted for any part of, this project because favorably because of what I think it will do to the community, the negative effects that it will have long term. I do think that this is one of the areas where there's, that outreach, that same passion for outreach that was in the beginning of the project that he should have had for this.
He did bring this to the neighborhood association. I mean, I was there when he brought it forward and asked for people's input on various points.
So
Just so you, I mean, this-
yeah. So I wasn't at the neighborhood association meeting, but there was the door-to-door outreach.
Right, earlier.
Yes,
Yeah.
earlier on. So
During the process of going, you said that there was notification to all neighborhoods. It's just part of the process. The adjacent neighbors were notified of just the
Well, anything
sign
that goes
plan.
before the BAR.
On
Right.
West Street there, I
Right,
think.
they're the standard rules about who gets notified.
Within
who
500
gets
feet
posted, right.
of the property.
yeah, but even when you get those notifications, not even speaking just towards this project, but in general, I live in the Belmont area. We just got, tons of notifications for the potential SIA changes. For you to show up for things like that, you have to believe that you have the ability to influence the outcomes. And for a lot of people, when they don't believe that, they'll stay home.
And I think there's always a question of what is community engagement that meets formal requirements versus what is community engagement that produces participation and outcome changes. And again, it's far from comprehensive or definitive, but I know that I've received numerous emails as well as messages and texts from people who saw the news story that the local news did on it and who live in the neighborhood and were only aware that it was going up as a large mural directly facing their neighborhood because of that news story, which went either today or yesterday ran.
So the cow is cuter than the horse. I don't know,
It's based
something
on the cow that used to
positive.
be in front of it. That big cow that used to be in the front of the dairy building.
And vegans hate this sign.
This is all part of a very comprehensive signage plan
Yeah,
they've been working on for over a year
yeah.
with the city.
I mean, we received the
timeline.
notification from him. And and I talked about this before, but another thing that's influencing my support, we just had another small business owner in the Avon neighborhood who was kind of put through, a very, I thought, process that they shouldn't have been put through about signage. And I don't think we should make these decisions the way we make them. And so that was another point. And again, when depending on who we're making the decision on behalf of, that's when it's presented in a more favorable light than other times.
And again, I mean, this is a project which just made the news. Some of the largest corporations in the country are renting out their Class A office space. I don't think this is going to make or break the project.
Well, they need a sign plan approved.
Okay.
I'm just asking the question, like, where are we at?
This is, a comprehensive signage plan is entirely your decision to make. There's only a recommendation from the BAR. But when I came on 2 years ago, the Dairy Central project was one of the first ones that I was dealing with as BAR staff, and that's when the idea of the cow of some type, attempting to replicate apparently the large cow statue that used to be in front of this building, and
I remember that statue well.
yeah. And so we said, that's a sign. If you're going to use this as, anything, any type of logo, then it's a sign. We have to regulate it as such. And the way to do that was through the comprehensive signage plan. So that as far as what they've been working on and working towards, this mural's been part of the discussion now for 2 years. But again, the decision's entirely yours. You can, what a comprehensive signage plan does, and we don't do a lot of them. I think you may be seeing one soon, trying to get Barracks Road Shopping Center to update theirs. And it allows the zoning staff who reviews the sign permits. I just look at them from the design review side of things. And for example, Barracks Road, someone comes in and instead of, every sign kind of, individually look at, we have a plan that the owner of that property has said, this is what I will accept, and we've agreed with that. And so it allows on a small or a large project like this, it allows staff to, but as far as having it's your decision if you want to amend it, change it. I don't know if the applicant's here. You certainly can ask for them to revisit something. But it does allow, for a project of this scale, it does allow staff sort of a blueprint for when these signage permits come in, that we can handle them a lot easier.
Because I didn't know we're
So I
discussing
have-
just one facet of a much broader plan,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, so if it's the cow mural, I understand that. I think, still with the 2 additional monument signs, given the scale, the comprehensive signage plan would be necessary to approve those.
And one question I had, just to commit to memory for the future. So the issue with the fading, what could you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, I guess this is where I disagree with the VAR. The concern was that there would be sort of the false impression of aging, and I'm like, all right, well, we'll just paint on there that this was painted in 2020. But, I'll defer to the design professionals on that, but that was their concern, that it not appear. We do have some old signage on walls around the city, and they're fading, but they do represent the past, and we want to maintain that story. So to sort of recreate something that misrepresents that, my only concern would be is if someone wanted to do a mural that looked old, it gets complicated, but.
Okay. So you're
Applicant,
ready?
representative wanted to speak, they said.
Are you, okay.
Did she leave too? I think this is, I don't think so.
No.
Yeah. Okay. So, any further discussion?
Do we want to hear from the applicant?
I think, do we
I'd
need to?
listen.
Yeah, I don't think,
I'm fine with listening.
I think there's some
I'm fine as-
support. Do we need the additional time?
Are you supporting it?
No, but I think three of y'all are.
The BAR has approved
Yeah,
this.
I'm with
Yeah,
it.
okay, we don't need it.
Well-
All right, so please vote. All right, so it carries 3-2. All right. That's why, I mean, it was there, so it didn't need it. Okay. Do y'all want to break before? All right, so, next we have a report, the report from the study of disproportionate minority contact in the adult criminal justice system. Yeah, I'm saying we didn't need to go through that.
No, I mean, this has been going back and forth with the BAR.
No, I'm just saying
Yeah.
with the.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. I'm Khaki Dimick. I'm the Director of Human Services for the city, and I'm representing the research and planning team of the Adult Disproportionate Minority Context Study, which was a subject of interest as long ago as the very beginning of the study of disproportionate minority contact in the juvenile justice system, so over a decade. That task force that was created by City Council quickly determined that it would be really helpful to have the same study and data and information about the adult criminal justice system. And Dave Chapman, then Commonwealth's attorney, became a pretty strong community champion for getting some legs and some funding around doing a study in the adult criminal justice system. We were lucky in 2016 to apply for, and in 2017 to be awarded a $100,000 grant from the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services to get started on this study. It is the first study of its kind, and so that means we had no roadmap to follow. So together with our consultants, we had to create a process. We are really grateful for the multidisciplinary regional research planning team that really helped sort of push this project through with really practical and thoughtful considerations about each one of the data points and the questions and decisions we had to make along the way. As you have seen in the report, it is not complete. This is going to be a multi-phased, multi-year kind of study for us to understand the entire criminal justice system. The research and planning team started with the premise that we wanted to determine not just disproportionality or disparity along multiple points in the system, but really along the continuum of the system. So how do people move through the adult criminal justice system, not just at one point in time? That required the creation of a master data set, and so we had data from the Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail, the Offender Aid and Restoration process data, and circuit court data that allowed us to integrate all of those data by person for the period of 2014 through 2016 in a master data set. Doing that allowed us to look at a fairly robust number of decision-making points in the adult criminal justice system. But it is not a complete set. And so I think it's important that when we introduce this project, we think about it as iterative and evolving. There are options for us to go further downstream to get data sets from corrections around probation violations, and to go further upstream to get more police contact data and calls for service data. And so our sort of next phase is to determine which way we go with that. As a result of having sort of no roadmap, we also then had to make decisions about what got left in and what got taken out. And so I really want to just emphasize that this is a work in progress And despite all of those potential limitations, the data reveals some very statistically significant points of disparity along the criminal justice system, and I'll let the consultants talk more about that. I will say that we will anticipate that the sort of next phase for us as a research and planning team is to debrief this particular process and say, how did this go for us? What would we have done differently? And what do we need to do next? And once we determine sort of which direction we'd like to go, then we'll start to search for additional dollars. But I anticipate that this is probably a 7 to 10 year process for us to really understand all of the sort of nuanced parts of our decision-making along the adult criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. I'm delighted to have 3 members of the team from MGT Consultants here with us tonight, Dr. Fred Seaman, Reginald Smith, and Andres Bernal, and I think Dr. Seaman's going to get us started.
Good evening, council members and staff. Fred Seaman, Executive Vice President, MGT Consulting. Very pleased to be here this evening to share with you the findings and recommendations that resulted from our study. And also want to say to you that the issues that we've addressed in this study is not just a Charlottesville, Virginia issue. This is a national issue. But we applaud you for having the courage, the political will, the community will to address an issue in a way that many communities have not. You know, it would be easy to say that there are more blacks in the criminal justice system because they commit more crimes, but that's not true. It's simply not true. So this is a very, very important study. Other communities have similar issues but have not chosen to address it in the way that you all have. So we really, really commend you and applaud you for doing so. And I'm going to turn this over to Reginald Smith, who was the project director, and Mr. Andres Bernal, both of whom did the heavy lifting on this study. And we look forward to having a conversation with you about our findings and recommendations. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for having us here to give us an opportunity to talk to you about our study, our findings and conclusions and recommendations. Once again, this is a very important study, and again, we commend you for having the courage to address such a very impactful and critical issue that's not only affecting Charlottesville, but communities throughout the country. We put together a brief presentation for you today, and what we're going to do is trying to make sure I do the right thing. We've done the opening remarks. We're going to talk about the study goals. We're going to talk about the 2 words that we use throughout this report, disproportionality and disparity. They are different. We're going to talk about our study methodology, how we went about conducting the study. Then we're going to share findings with you and our recommendations. And then we'll have closing remarks, and then we'll answer any questions that you may have related to our presentation or our study. A little bit about MGT of America Consulting, LLC, is that we are a national consulting and research firm. I've been around since 1974. We have conducted over 12,000 engagements since 1974, and we've been doing these types of studies related to disparity, diversity, equity, inclusion since 1990. So we've been in the business for a long time doing these types of studies. We do additional type of studies such as disparity studies, availability studies, MWBE programs, implementation studies, diversity, equity, and inclusion studies. But we have done, like I say, over 220 different studies since 1990 related to disparity, and we're very proud of what we've accomplished. So this particular study for the city of Charlottesville and Albemarle County, we had several goals in mind when we did this study. The first goal was to update the mapping of the current criminal justice system. There were outdated maps that were in existence, and the first thing we did was updated those maps to make sure that they reflected the current system in this local criminal justice system. And that's in the report as well, I think, as Appendix A. Then we determined the extent of racial disproportionality and disparity in the local criminal justice system. Then we analyzed the reasons, for any disproportionality or disparities that we may find, and then we were to make recommendations regarding policy best practices to address those issues and work with stakeholders related to the implementation of those recommendations. I want to talk a little bit about disproportionality and disparity. Disproportionality, basically, you're looking at the ratio of persons processed in the criminal justice systems by race, ethnicity, at a particular decision point within the criminal justice continuum, and you compare that to the general population by race, ethnicity. So, for example, if we're saying that Charlottesville, the African American males make up 12% of the population, then the jail population should be reflective of that 12%. Anything lower or higher will be disproportionate, okay? That's disproportionality. Now, disparity is where you guys have moved the needle when it comes to these types of studies. You wanted to look at individuals of different races and ethnicities who are similarly situated, in other words, similar violations, similar criminal histories, and other characteristics across the different various decision points. Were they treated differently because of race or ethnicity? So we're looking at disparate treatment as opposed to disproportionality. So those are different. Those are two different things. So our charge was are people of different races and ethnicities being treated differently in the criminal justice system solely because of race, which is a very important part of the study. So to do this study, we had to collect a lot of data, okay? The following data sets were used: the Albemarle and Charlottesville jail booking data, the offender aid and restoration process data, OAR data, and then the Albemarle Charlottesville circuit court and general district court data. Those are the three data sets that we used, and we combined all of them into a master database so that we could do the cross-referencing, the correlating, tracking people between the different areas to see could we come up with whether or not there was a disparity related to these data sets. We also determined relative rates in the study, and I really encourage everyone to read the study because it really gives a lot more information in this brief presentation that we're giving you today. We know we only have 3 hours to present. So we had to condense, and I know we got 15 minutes, so I know we have to move forward, okay? So, for example, relative rates. For example, the population of black males in 2014 in Charlottesville was 4,034. During that time, the black males in Charlottesville were booked a total of 827 times. So the relative rate was 0.205. And these are the type of disparity, disproportionality. These are the types of statistics that we've got all throughout the report related to that. We also created a navigable dashboard that includes relative rates by race and gender. And that would be available probably starting tomorrow to be on the internet as soon as we will release it. So anybody can go in there and look at it. It's very customizable, and there are different various ways you can pull up different issues related to race, years, booking, the whole 9 yards. I think you'll really be pleased when you see that dashboard. But it is available for your use.
That 827, is that bookings or is that individuals? That
It was bookings.
827
It's
times,
bookings.
so it's like it could be one individual with 14 bookings.
We tried to look.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Our questions that we asked ourselves: what factors influence outcomes following a booking event? And are outcomes associated with the race of the person booked, detained, and or sentenced? Are outcomes associated with the race of a person booked, detained, and or sentenced? I want to talk a little bit, well, I'm going to let Andres Bernal, our statistician, talk about regression analysis and regression models. I learned a long time ago to stay in my lane, and statistics is not my deal. So I'm going to turn it over to our expert, Andres Bernal, to talk about regression. Andres?
And thank you, everybody. I think this is where the really exciting parts happen, especially for me, because I love the data from it. But basically put, just to be very simple and quick, I know everybody's been here a long time, but at this point, we can't argue that there is a disproportionality. We see it, the data shows it. It's not a lot of argument about that. But what we're trying to determine now is, does race affect the outcomes that we see at the various different decision points? And that is what we're trying to do with the study. Is there disparity? Are people treated differently just because of the race? So the simplest thing that we do here is the hypothesis that we're looking at. Does race affect outcome? And does the disproportionality we see, is it due to some kind of factor? Did it happen by random chance? Or did it happen because these folks were of different races? That was what we were going in here when we looked at it. And we looked at it at different decision points throughout that we could match it through the data. To go back to what Reggie had said, the reason we loved looking at those 3 data sets was because we could actually see somebody throughout the whole continuum that we had data for. The reason is we were able to match that individual to the AOR data, to the circuit court data, and the ACGR, or I think that's the acronym they use. Yes, thank you, to that data set. And the reason we chose linear regression, and I'll show you in a second, and logistics regression is because they're very simplistic data sets. They're just additive equations. And they're very powerful, they're very accurate, and they're very simple to understand. This is the whole math behind it. It's just a fancy additive equation, but this is how it looks out in our data. What we're looking at, and we looked at bond decisions, we looked at seriousness of the primary charge, we looked at the total number of charges after the most serious crime was charged. We looked at length of stay. We looked at total length of stay after they were charged or after they were sentenced. And what we're looking at the end of the day, what we're trying to do when we put all of this data into our model is when we compare 2 like individuals, a African-American male to a non-minority or to a white male, African-American female to a white female, is race the only difference that matters to when we see this disproportionality? So we looked at an individual's most serious crime in this instance. We looked at their race, their age, their status, their level of education, total number of charges, total number of prior arrests. And this is something that we looked through the whole continuum of length of stay, all those other variables that we talked about. And when we, at the end of the day, what we tried to do is, like I said, when we compared 2 like individuals that had the same serious crime, the same age, the same employment status, the same level of education, what was left over? We understand that, like Kaki said, this isn't perfect. There's going to be iterative once we look at more data, once more things. But at the end of the day, what was so fascinating about our conclusions is We can't tell you definitively that it was due to some sort of discrimination by Joe Schmo or institutional, but we can tell you that what we saw in these were not happening by random chance. There is something going on here that we need to investigate. Like I said, we can't tell you that it was some sort of discrimination, that it was, we can't tell you that, but we can tell you that there is something there that we need to look at further. And that's why Kaki says that this could take a while just to look at the data and continue it, because there's definitely different avenues that we want to try to dive into. So this is a little bit about, the factors that we looked at. This is just kind of overall, seriousness of charge, total number of charges, individual priors. Some of the things that the socioeconomics, and that's something that we really want to dive into more of an effect, is the economic status, employment, educational, because we know that all that matters. But what I'm saying is, at the end of the day, still, when we looked at all these pools, it was what we say statistically significant at a 95% confidence interval. And what that means is, when we look at a bell curve and look at the outliers, most of the times when we compare people with the effective race, it was always the same kind of effect. So it wasn't happening by chance. Oops, wrong way. Oh my God, sorry about that. You want to talk about the anecdotal, Reggie, before we talk about the conclusions? I'm going to turn it over. Now, the other part of it was the anecdotal, so we can tell you the data. Now we're trying to dive into what are the perceptions that we are seeing in some of the results, and Reggie's going to talk about that as well.
Okay, so the courts always like to see anecdotal data. It's not statistically valid. It certainly is valuable information. It's basically perceptions and opinions of people we talk to. And we talk to a bunch of folks, okay? Perceptions and opinions. But you add that to the data to see whether or not you can, whether or not the data's making sense, kind of put a face to the numbers. So anecdotal data is very important. So we gathered anecdotal data regarding perceptions. We gathered opinions related to disproportionality, related to disparate minority treatment, and regarding dispositions of cases and things of that nature. We gathered opinions regarding possible issues at various points along the law enforcement, legal, judicial, and corrections continuum. So when we looked at this, when we did our study, we looked at the whole the local criminal justice system, and we looked at decision points along those continuums, right? And then we looked at what data would support decision at certain points, and wherever those points were, then that's what we were able to validate. Other decision points, we didn't have enough data to do that, but if in the next phase of this study, then we can certainly drill down into those areas as well. So we involved the Disproportionate Minority Research and Planning Group during the entire time that we worked on this study. We had focus group with law enforcement, attorneys, and inmates. We had in-depth interviews with city and county community leaders. And we had 4 community engagement meetings where everyone's involved to come to talk to us about their experiences with disproportionality and disparity. And our key conclusions related to our disparity findings, again, this falls into the statistical arena. So I'm going to let Andres talk about these.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. Okay, so once we looked at all of the data, these were our key findings. When you look at the actual report, you're going to see some of the magnitudes of it. We did this for kind of overall what we're finding, but when you look at the actual report, you can see some of the more stark magnitudes and differences. We also break it out when we say African American. We mean African American male and female. We do actually break it out as much as we can in the report. But for example, and these are the hypotheses we had. So for the first one, race of arrestees and the seriousness of charge, we found that there was disparity for an African American having more serious charge leveled to them. Race of arrestees and the seriousness of the charge, with African American defendants having a larger number of total charges. We found disparity, and it goes back to when we mean disparity, it didn't happen by random chance. This was statistically significant findings. Race in the determination of whether an individual was held with or without bond, with African Americans more likely to be denied release. So basically what this one was trying to look at was, is an African American more likely to be denied bond than their white counterparts? We did find disparity there. Length of time a defendant was held in jail prior to trial. This one was just for African American males. We did find disparity there. In the two instances that is interesting and definitely would like to dive in a little bit more to it as well was the last one, the second to last one, length of sentence for African American males when compared with white males sentenced in circuit court. That was a little bit low, down the stream. We didn't find statistically significant. We found no disparity there. And then the final one was the duration of actual time served after sentence. And what that means is when an individual is sentenced and then some of their sentence is commuted or whatever happens in the court system, the actual time served in days, we did not find disparity. So there was no race difference or no race disparity in that outcome. So some of the overall conclusions from the study itself is that regardless of race, males charged with more serious crimes accompanied by a record of prior charges. So what that means is, the most serious crime, and then we know that they have a record of prior charges, and who spent more days in jails prior to sentencing received longer sentences. That's kind of a general one for all males. And that goes back to our equation. We didn't look at just, race versus the outcome. We looked at all these other factors. So that one's regardless of race, males were charged more than females in that instance. For males in general, for all categories of crimes, because we try to also dive as much as the data would allow us to violent crimes, property crimes. We try to do that, and the report itself shows some of those breakouts that we try to do with the data limitations we have. But in this instance, in general, for males in general, for all categories of crime, neither the total number of charges associated with the most serious charge nor the jurisdiction played a significant role in time sentence. That's something else that we're trying to dive a little bit further in the next phase of it. But we did try to put in a jurisdictional variable to see what the difference was in Albemarle versus Charlottesville. But it wasn't the same as literally just splitting the data. That would have been the best to do, was just to split the data and test them individually to see what the effect is in Charlottesville and then to see what the effect was in Albemarle, because we do know that there are institutional differences in both communities. Because we wanted a robust data set, we did it at a regional level and still try to put a jurisdictional variable in there. So that just means when you see in the data set, you see the magnitude of African American male or African American female plus the jurisdictional variable will kind of give you an idea of what is happening in Charlottesville versus Albemarle. And then before we get to the recommendations, one of the final two key conclusions, because there's definitely a lot of different conclusions that we have in the actual report itself. For African American women, and this is where we try to break it down, race, crime seriousness, total number of companion charges, a record of prior criminal charges, and the time they had spent in jail prior to sentencing were all positively related to the sentence duration outcomes. Once again, we want to dive a little bit more into it. When it came to the African American women and white women, the data was just not as robust and granular as we would have liked it, so that's why everything gets lumped in together. For African American males charged with drug-related, and this one's an interesting one, when African American males charged with drug-related crimes, race was not a significant influence on sentence time decision, but the seriousness of the offense, the total number of charges associated with the main drug crime charge, and the individual length of stay prior to sentences, they were all statistically significant influences. Once again, definitely want to dive a little bit more into that one because that's an interesting finding, but that is what the data right now is telling us. I'm going to turn the recommendations over to Reggie.
Okay, so after all our findings and conclusions, we came up with a series of recommendations in the report, and we've just highlighted a few here. The first one is to increase and support meaningful reentry programs. And I know that you guys are already doing some things in this area. So what we're recommending is that you continue these and then evaluate these programs to see how successful they are. You currently have the Charlottesville and Albemarle Reentry Council. You've got Healthy Transitions, Coming Home to Work, Home to Hope, and the OER reentry program. So you've got some programs already in place. But what we're recommending is that you look at these programs to see how successful they are. We also know that in 2010, you issued a resolution to be Charlottesville the city of second chance for offenders. And then we recommend that you continue and increase support for each of these programs that we certainly mentioned. So we're saying that do some research on these programs, see how effective they are, do a survey, focus groups to try to determine whether or not you are moving in the right direction, and if so, if you need to make some course corrections, then do so. The next recommendation we made is increased transparency of city and county police departments. We know that the city should develop policies that will increase transparency related to the police departments. We're saying that we know you do have some things in place. The police department is currently releasing arrest data on a daily basis by race. We know that the Albemarle Police Department is providing real-time information on police activities. And then the Charlottesville City Council is developing and funding an independent police civilian review board, and we commend you for moving in that direction. The community members share frustration about not being able to obtain information and documentation related to their charges and arrests from police departments. So we strongly encourage that the city move in the direction of being more transparent. We recommend that you move forward in fully functioning a police civilian review board, moving that direction. Another recommendation was to maintain, develop, and encourage and support special initiative programs. And in all these recommendations that we've made here in the report, we did acknowledge the things that you're currently doing. So, like I say, you're doing some things and recommending that you evaluate these programs that you have and then see if there's something else that you can be doing to continue to move in the right direction. So for developing and encouraging and supporting special initiatives, things such as mentor programs, they have a positive impact on both the mentor and the mentee. Things like fatherhood initiative programs, and then increased police interactions with the community. Those are things that you need to try to move toward to improve the relationship between police and the communities. There are some current initiatives in place here. You got the Mentoring for Youth program. You have fatherhood program. The Charlottesville Police Department is doing community outreach activities such as Cop for Kids and then the ice cream with the cop. So they are doing some things, need to do more like that. The Albemarle Police Department is offering outreach activities. They did over 439 outreach activities last year. And then the Partner for Mental Health. That's a good program which basically help navigate these services for inmates. So again, look at these programs, analyze them, determine what needs to be done, what's successful and what's not. We recommend increased diversity in law enforcement. Here, we are recommending that you take more aggressive measures to increase diversity in law enforcement. We know that you're doing some work in this area towards that, such as the Charlottesville Police Department is actively recruiting minority applicants. The Albemarle Police Department has a diverse recruiting team of sworn officers and civilian staff, and they're focusing on the HBCUs, the historical black colleges and universities, as well as the local institutions of higher education. So they are doing some things there, but to continue and to be more aggressive in that area to increase diversity related to law enforcement. Number 5 is adopt programs that are alternatives to incarceration. So, you know, if there's an opportunity to not put somebody in jail, let's do it. So we are recommending that that you look in that area and make some improvements there. Again, you are doing some things. You've got the adult drug treatment court for Charlottesville and Albemarle, and you got the therapeutic docket, and then you got the family treatment court. So you're doing some things. Other things need to be done as well to reduce the cost of incarceration. Provide additional training opportunities. Here, when we're talking about additional training opportunities, we're talking about training for police officers as far as de-escalation, how to de-escalate a situation. We're talking about being able to determine behavioral health issues related to that. We're recommending other types of additional training like implicit bias training, the mental behavior health issues faced by offenders, and then, like I said, the de-escalation techniques, which are very important in community relations. We recommend that you review best practices from other communities. Like we said in the beginning, that you're not the only community faced with these issues. And there are some best practices out there, people, what they're doing, how they're dealing with these issues. Reach out to them, talk to their police officers and their judges and attorneys and their criminal justice system representative to see how they're dealing with those issues. And then see if there's anything that's transferable back here to Charlottesville. So that will definitely help you as you move forward. And then finally, recommendation is conduct additional research and build upon the findings and the recommendations of this study. Again, we're just starting. You know, we talked about the limitations of data as we started. All studies have limitations. This study had limitations and data was a limitation. This data that we could have gotten and analyzed that we're not able to get. We would like to look at the police data. We'd like to get the magistrate data. There are a number of different things that we like to do to continue this work to give you more robust recommendations and a clear path to improvement in this community. So that in a nutshell is our presentation on our report and our activities related to this, how we went about doing the study, our findings and conclusions and recommendations. And now we are open to respond to any questions that you may have about our report or our presentation.
Are you presenting this to the county's Board of Supervisors this week as well? Are you presenting this to the county's Board of Supervisors as well?
No, we're not on their agenda yet.
So,
Can I ask you? Can I ask you a question? Were you able to determine in looking at the data, or did you have enough information to be able to look at, for example, stops on the street versus stops in cars, or the method of the police contact with the individual?
No, we were not, and that's some additional data that we would like to get so that we can analyze that. Once again, when we gave you those 3 data sets, we're able to relate all 3 of those. And the police data, we was not able to relate into the data set to give you that continuum. But we really would like to get that data and analyze it to be able to respond to that question.
and so how was that decision made? Was that part of the decision of what remained in, what remained out? And so I guess I'll.
Both police departments were very happy to give us data. The ability to integrate it into the master data set was really a condition of the study from the beginning. And so we had some trouble trying to figure out how, because of the way the data is stored, and frankly, the data is stored differently in each one of these sort of system component processes, and also in the decision-making components. And so it was sort of a miracle to come up with this master data set with these 3 pools that we have. It is probably likely that we could get the existing data from the police departments and integrate it. It was just prohibitively expensive in terms of both time and money for us to do it for this cycle. And quite frankly, we had already had a misstep with our first set of consultants, and so we were already sort of 12 to 18 months behind in terms of meeting the community's expectations of getting something. So the research and planning team decided perfect was the enemy of good, and we were starting with what we had. So that does not at all indicate a lack of willingness from the police departments or a lack of interest on our part. It's just we started with the data set we had in front of us.
And so that, my same questions all the way up to, I think, every part we can control, which would be up until the judge. I think that's probably the only individual in the community that we probably can't influence or have direct conversation with about changing practices. So was that data collected about who? So you have the numbers in terms of how many people are booked, how many people are denied bail at the magistrate level, OAR court. Did you all collect data on which magistrate, which judge, which member of OAR staff?
We were not able to get any magistrate data.
Okay.
How about judge data?
It would be in
It would be in the courts.
available. We didn't do any comparisons. That was not part of the study scope at that point. But it's available.
I mean, admittedly, my interest as a criminal defense lawyer is almost like a prurient interest to know which judges are doing what, you know, which ones are worse than others, but.
Well, and also, like, if you had an attorney, and what kind of attorney did you have? I think there's
Right.
lots of questions
Whether it's
around
a-
process
yeah.
considerations, and for us thinking about, like, every one of these findings, while dramatic and reinforcing of community perception of the system, it begs a series of additional sort of sets of whys, right? And so
Yeah.
when we think about sort of what comes next, do we go upstream for more data, downstream for more data, or dig deeper in the data we have? And which is why I keep trying to set the expectation that this is a marathon sort of data problem for us.
So.
And there are certain things that you can be doing now out of this list of recommendations.
Yeah.
You don't have to wait to get additional data. There's some things you could be doing right now based on the list of recommendations that we've given you.
And so I think that would be my first point, would be if you were a member of the Black community, as I am, this is something that I've been saying for years, you didn't need the study in the first place. You have the lived experience of it, so you know firsthand what is happening, what is occurring, what's occurring in other neighborhoods by members who are white, who are doing similar activities to you, and that there are differences in who's released on bond, sentencing, and you understand that from firsthand experience. And I think that's one of the biggest frustration, from the community, because it was always assumed that you had to get a study like this started. When you said 7 to 10 years, I was, stable over there, but almost not. Because, when you're thinking about the lives and the cyclical nature of, that's produced from situations like this, you're talking about another generation of kids affected, another, families who are affected, children seeing their parents incarcerated, as a result of, I know we said we don't know the why, but that is the response that racism and the institution of it wants us to, kind of play in that safe space. We do know the why, and the why has been apparent, since enslavement ended, right, of the next measures of control. I know you all quoted Michelle Alexander in the study, but in her work, talking about just the next phases of that system, and incarceration was, that next phase. So, and even with the recommendation, from a staff standpoint, these are things that we have been doing. The city has been investing millions of dollars into some of these programs and a lot of staff time, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that it's going to work. If you don't remove the problem, and without us being able to address the who, because I think we know the why and we know how it's being done. But I think we have to be as clear in the community, if that is the direction that we're going to move, that people were comfortable with this disproportionality and disparate treatment in removing the individuals who are perpetuating those behaviors.
I think the community, we have questions to ask. Again, I talked about the 3 sort of various places we could go with finding out more information with this data set or with additional data sets. We could also say we have enough information to be convinced and we're going to start to solve the issue. And I think MGT is recommending we solve the issue in multiple places. Clearly this it didn't start off with the intention of sort of identifying individuals. I will say that if we've identified a point of disparity in decision making, we would like to know very much about how those decisions are made. And historically in these kinds of studies, we find that the places where disparity exists are the places where there's the largest amount of discretionary decision making with a human being. And so we would like to know more about those. There's likely a policy solution to those things as opposed to 10 more years of study. And so I think I'm suggesting that this study is a long-term process, but it isn't without action around fixing it.
And I think policy and people, one of the questions I had, 3.8, was when you looked at the tables 3.1, 3.2, when you're talking about policy procedures, and I say people and policy, it seems like this, we fund OAR, right? I don't know what data you all collected because we don't see, all of it on that end, but it shows a significant difference between the bond amount at OAR for white males versus black males. That was a significant difference. And for an organization that we provide funding to do this work, when you see something highlighted such as that should be addressed immediately. Because that's a point within the system on the map where that is clear and something we can control. So I hope that staff is looking at, this data and not just, again, I know we often have the conversation about relationships, and that a lot of these hard conversations will be had amongst friends, but to to see that was pretty significant. And that's a conversation that can easily be had.
Mayor Walker, what page are you looking at there?
3.8.
3.8, okay.
I guess a smaller question about the data. I mean, I know you said there's limitations and obviously more analysis to be done, but I'm just curious, like some of the variables like employment and education used to try and disentangle the role that race is playing. Was there any analysis done of the role that race and institutional racism could play in determining those variables of like education, employment level, other variables?
No, and I think, when there's a slide that Andrea said that race was not an issue in sentencing, but all of the other things that were subject to, that impacted sentencing, if you looked at those separately, race was a factor in those, right? So I think, we recognize that it's layered, and so the question is how far do we look, and what information, how does it drive our sort of decision-making or action? And I do think the research and planning team will have a big conversation to have around that. And then try to find some money to help implement some of this.
And this data is it correct? It's from 2014 to 2016?
To 2016, that's correct.
And after that, data collection moved in a substantial way to a new tool. And so for us, the question is, it's a little bit sort of granular, but do we look to the data in the new tool, or we try to get data from the same period to integrate the same master set, and knowing that it's sort of aging even more significantly over time if we stick there. So again, lots of questions.
Yeah.
So on the computer model that you all created, will you be able to, like where it says crimes with which African American males were charged with nearly 3 points greater in seriousness value than crimes for white males, will you be able to click on something and see what, like examples of what those charges were, whether they were, what?
We created a whole, you're talking about the disproportionality, right? We created a whole, and that's what Reggie had mentioned, a whole, imagine just a census of it, that somebody can literally go in and just click all those different variables by race, by gender, jurisdiction, and it just creates graphs for you. And you can actually literally pull down that data that we used as well. So it's just a navigable, it depends, and that's where we're going to talk with Kaki of how we're going to house it, because we could literally just put it into, it's Microsoft Dashboard is what it's called, and you can put it on a web, and you can literally just click on it, and it creates a little bar charts or little line charts or whatever, and shows you all the data that you were referring to at the granular level.
If I could follow up on one of Mayor Walker's questions. Looking again at page 3.8, tables 3.1 and 3.2, you have bond amount booking, bond amount OAR, bond amount court. What are the definitions of those three categories?
It's out of my lane.
Okay, Andreas?
It's in your lane. Okay, come on up.
Those are bond decisions at three
Oh,
different points in the
Neil,
process.
could you?
Neil.
Sure.
Just so the public.
Neil Goodlow, criminal justice planner. I worked with these fine folks to assemble the data set so that they could analyze them. The question you refer to on page 3-8 in table 3-1 and 3-2.
And also on the next page too, but yes.
So those are bond booking amounts at three different points.
So, I mean,
in the process?
Bond amount, is that bond amount booking, is that the bond assessed or fixed by the magistrate?
Correct.
OAR doesn't fix a bond.
It's after first appearance. At first appearance, that bond can be modified.
Okay, but when it says bond amount OAR, OAR doesn't fix a bond.
OAR does not fix a bond.
So what does bond amount OAR mean?
That is the bond amount that is at the first appearance.
In front of the judge.
In front of the judge where OAR makes a bond recommendation.
Okay. I've not known OAR to make a recommendation of a specific amount.
They do not.
Okay, so that's the judge's decision.
That is correct.
So it's not OAR that is making that
It's
decision.
not OAR setting any bond amount.
And so when it says bond amount court, that's the amount that the judge sets without OAR having been involved.
I presume. I do not know the answer to
Okay.
that.
Okay.
But with that factor is, which are the OAR's recommendation influences the decision.
OAR's recommendation,
Evaluation, yes.
their evaluation influences the judge's decision-making on hold versus release,
yes.
on release to personal recognizance versus release to supervision, and could potentially influence a decision on bond amount.
But OAR also did not, of course, we're now talking 3 or 4 years ago, doesn't assess everybody. They assess frankly, the bigger cases, the
That's
harder
correct.
cases. So the kinds of cases that come out with an OAR involvement at all are likely to be more serious than the cases that don't have OAR's involvement. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say.
Okay.
But that would be also influenced by the seriousness factor of what
And the
charges
number
was
of
brought.
companion
Yes.
charges,
Right.
and the risk assessment,
And
ties to
without
the local
having,
community. There are all kinds of things that go into that bond recommendation.
but all of that is influenced by data we don't have, right, in terms of that initial contact and what charges were initially brought on and why. We don't have that information.
We don't have any view into the magistrate's decision-making at all. Because they are, the magistrate is a judicial officer, and their data is controlled by the Supreme Court of Virginia. And we are not allowed to have access to it, at least at this time.
I also have a clarifying question. So I'm reading here, the prior means, assuming that priors are prior convictions, that the mean priors is almost double for white American males, but length of stay is almost half. Am I reading that correctly?
And that was just for the data set that we tested.
Yeah.
Also, a question that I had was what happened with or why wasn't data related to federal court, and what happens at that point considered?
Just the scope of the scale of the study, so how much time we had and how much money we had.
Okay. But were you able to pick up in your data cases that were, that moved from state level to federal? Where did you all
think so,
collect
yeah, I don't
any
think so.
of that? Okay. So there was data in here where there wasn't outcome data. Somewhere in here it said that there were,
Like outcomes in terms of sentencing.
Sentencing.
And then the difference between sentencing and the actual time served. We didn't
well, I
look
think
at
it was just
probation
the
violations at all.
sentencing because you would lose some of those individuals who were initially booked if they were moved to
Right.
federal.
Yeah.
So I assume that they were in those numbers.
I think if they moved through, they wouldn't be, right? Our master data set includes people
But it
who were
was-
in all the,
Okay, so they had to be in every category, okay.
And this is also innocent people too, correct? People who were originally booked.
presumably who
But
didn't get
per-
sentenced to anything because they were found not guilty.
So the master data, what proportion of it became the master data set versus the starting data set that allowed you to kind of have, because it seemed like you had to hit a certain number of thresholds of these points in time so that you could follow it through the system? I'm just trying to get a sense for,
I mean, if we could integrate the data in a timely and cost-effective way, we did, right? So what that looked like was the three sources of data, which were the jail data, OAR data, and circuit court data. Magistrate data was just not available to us at all, and of course, it is a place where there's significant disparity identified, and so that begs a lot of questions about how decisions are made under what circumstances. We'd love to have access to that data to know more about that. Yeah.
And to your point, I couldn't tell you right off the top, what number percentage what number of individuals had met all of our criteria throughout the whole data set. We matched everybody together that we could, and of course, like to your point, somebody may not go through the whole system. I can get that data and I could look, see what it was, but that wasn't something that we were particularly looking to dive into.
So, I think my maybe last two questions or points would be, would this have been, I guess, a more robust report if it had been just collecting data for the city of Charlottesville? I mean, was the partnership with the county, did that influence the work in any way?
That's a complicated question. I mean, I think it has to have. I don't know that I can say how, but I think, when I do a project just by myself, I get to make all the decisions. I get to decide what we do, what we don't do. There's, I don't have checks and balances or other people to have to consider. And so certainly having a multidisciplinary and regional research and planning committee meant that we were making decisions as a group. And so that was slower and more complicated than it might have been if we had just sort of had one driver in it. So I mean, I think the study is far more robust by having Albemarle included in it. We were thrilled to have them be involved. I think one of the really big deficits from the juvenile justice system is that we weren't able to look at a regional impact. And so that's really what sort of spurred the original interest in doing the adult study, was that we recognized what a gap that was in the juvenile justice examination, that we didn't have a regional approach. I think we are a service center, and so we know we have folks coming in and out of both of the city and the county pretty freely without sort of regard to those.
And that's my question was about their interest in this output and how it's going to be presented, because I think that this is something we have to look at regionally. I mean, there are no boundaries for so many people that are here. I mean, we all share this space, and we need to be tackling this problem together.
I don't think we can speak for the county's leadership, but we can certainly speak for the county participants in the process. They've been there from the beginning. There's been no waxing or waning in their interest or their commitment to the participation.
And the recommendations, I'm really interested in what next steps, how we come up with what next steps are, and who's at the table for next steps. One of the emails that we received from Adiola, who talked about not necessarily feeling that the initial plan for the planning committee, steering committee happened the way that it was discussed, and who gets left out of that equation and who, is left at the table. When I read these recommendations, as someone who worked very hard to get Home to Hope, supported, and knowing what hopefully how that is different from other things listed here, Eddie Harris was just here to talk about his, some of his thoughts, and he didn't get to speak about, the effects of incarceration on families and how we can't wait, and how, I'm speaking now from back to me, but how we've been talking about, my perception is what I'm saying, how we've been talking about this for years, and we didn't need the study because it's our family members, it's our friends, it's some of us who have, been through, this criminal justice system and have been affected by it. As someone who has worked at Region 10 for 5 years, then, Drug Court, Family Treatment Court is on here, and they're good attempts. I mean, it's again, when we're talking about well-intentioned people, but do they really work? And that's a conversation that we really have to have, is these things are in place. People will say going through a drug court program versus being in jail or prison, you know, that's what they're weighing. But is it life-changing and life-altering? And these are all addressing the individual who have been through this broken system versus the removal of people who perpetuate these type of behaviors and then attempting to undo what systemic racism has put in place in this community and other communities. And there's a big difference between that.
I think, I mean, there's a lot packed in there, but I think one of the questions for us are, and certainly my interest, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the research and planning team in this moment, because I do think we've worked really hard to make decisions as a team, and so I can't speak for them. But I am very interested in asking the community those questions about what it is that we do next. If we had limited dollars, limited time, what do we want to continue the study? Which direction? Do we want to talk about these, evaluate the tools we already have in place? Do we want to develop new tools? Do we want to talk about accountability? How do we want to move forward? What do we need more of in the community? And I would suggest along that continuum of sort of primary prevention activities even further upstream, I think deserve some attention. So I think it's important for the research and planning team to consider it, but it would be my interest to have that be community driven. So I'll just say that.
And I would hope that council would support in terms, because you mentioned limited dollars and what the vision would be working with that. But again, you're talking about based on the data that we have here, that that this is not happening by accident. Mm-hmm. There is intention behind these acts that are affecting people negatively. So this is an area where we can't say with limited, that we have to say whatever is necessary to repair this needs to be done. And there needs to be the commitment, whatever that looks like. And it can't be 7 to 10 years, because what I do when someone tells me to wait 7 and 10 years, I go and look in a kid's face who is in 4th or 5th grade and ask where they're going to be in 7 to 10 years. And the data will tell you where they're most likely headed in this community. It's not fair to them for us to ask them to wait and for us to not take this seriously. And this moves beyond what the usual conversation is about Black people modifying their behavior. This shows that that's not what this is about, and that there's a bigger system at play. And we have had enough conversation in this community, which we've been saying forever, this was happening way before 2017, and that was part of the frustration. But for people who think it started in 2017, then you have enough information now to show you that it was happening before then, and then we can tell you it was happening way before then.
If I can, Mayor Walker. The thing that I, as the data person, would like to say is, I mean, we think about this as 7, 10 years. We're not waiting for the 7 to 10 years to give you an answer, because we understand that this needs to be actionable and needs to be actionable right now. So for the, for example, for the 4th grader, if that's something that we think that's going to be most impactful for the community, that's something in the mapping system we can start looking at, and I can start crunching the numbers. I can do whatever if I have the data, I can look at anything and see how it's impacted. I don't have to wait, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years to give you the answer. I can give you the answer once I have those data. But what we're trying to say is, we're starting at the big picture, and now we're starting to narrow, and that's where we need the community's input. We need your input to say, because we've gotten some great feedback from all the council persons here. We can look at maybe its institutional race effects of education on employment and all that. We can look at all those factors, or we can even look at the judges. But that's something, the decisions that we need to be making as a group of what do we feel is going to impact the community and is going to be the most actionable right now.
And Kaki, you know me, but I don't think we can move forward if we don't look at the who, because we're talking about people who are still making a lot of these decisions. People who are sitting at the table making decisions about what this looks like moving forward. And so that's an important piece that I think we have to be bold enough and, to take a look at.
I think one of the things that we noted pretty early on is that the city itself is not responsible for any one of these system components that we're talking about, right? And so there's independence across the board. And so one of the press questions earlier today was, how are you going to make sure that this impacts changes at each one of those levels? And so I'm not sure if that's the research and planning team's sort of job. I think that's more of a sort of a political will kind of conversation around looking at the who, or looking at those kinds of, how do you influence those systems that are relatively independent from our sort of bailiwick or responsibility or accountability streams. And I'm not sure if I know how to do that, so.
Likewise, it's less a question for the consultants or staff than just a comment, but yeah, I mean, one of the big questions I have is, what does this change? We spent several years, a significant amount of money and staff time produce it. What, if anything, changes in the behavior and policies of the city as a result of this? That's a question in part for us as a council to resolve, but I think it's a really important one. I don't know if I can't remember if we formally scheduled or not a work session on issues of equity and institutional racism, but I think, in that, that kind of work session, thinking about the future of the, making a hiring decision of the director for the Office of Equity, like, how do we start to incorporate this into how the city makes decisions to really create more systemic change? Because I think, as others mentioned, part of it's decisions we make as city council, part of it is things coming from the Office of the Commonwealth's Attorney, part of it is judges, part of it is state government. So how, to the extent possible, do we encourage that interdepartmental collaboration and communication and policy change in these areas? And because we see all the time studies that are produced and we put it on a shelf, but nothing actually changed. And it's just one piece of it, but I will note as well, and I know this is part of a larger conversation that we'll have as a council, but a significant part of this comes from that initial point of contact between the police and a community member. And one of the recommendations is, direct quote, we strongly recommend that the city move forward on establishing a fully functioning, independent civilian review board. The community is paying attention and places a good deal of value on this project, end quote. There's also points about the importance of analyzing and collecting data, as well as the importance of rebuilding trust. And I do think for us as a council, we do need to have a conversation, think about whether this current iteration of the CRB has community trust, and how do we best ensure that we know it performs the functions of data analysis and auditing, and doesn't repeat the process that we've seen with some new commissions that are created that don't have community trust and sort of fade into the background without changing things. That's one small piece of it. I think that's a similar dynamic with policy change across the board throughout the city on these issues. But I think it's something we will have to be very intentional about, obviously, on council, to really be serious about what does it mean to take this study and make change that actually changes anything.
That's right.
And to that point, what change looks like, one of my other recommendations for us to consider during this budget cycle, but when you talk about even the level that an auditor or executive director would be, the recommendation of having a deputy assistant, a deputy city manager of equity and human services is also, you have someone who can go into any department that is right under the city manager, that can have those conversations and direct, and not just be either equal to or under other people within the city. So I think there's even a bigger picture to what does CRB equity office, human rights office, what the work human services is doing, social services, all of those places look like under someone who is right under our city manager.
And I would agree. I think it's similar, somewhat separate, but related issue of climate change, but something that affects every department, every decision we make, and it has to be incorporated in that way. So I agree. I mean, one of the conclusions, I take from this data that, we knew beforehand as well, is that it's not about individuals' intentions, it's about systems and institutions, and that therefore institutional change has to be the solution. So I hope, we move in that direction. And I'd also say as well, I mean, as was mentioned, this is a problem, I think, across the state of Virginia, and we can't use it as an excuse to not take action, and we can't use it as an excuse to limit our ambitions locally, but we should be aware as well that, like, during this General Assembly session, there's some modest criminal justice reform being put forward, but there are also Democrats in committee arguing for more mandatory minimums and for tough on crime policies. And so as well to, not use it as an excuse to not take action locally, but also think about how are these systems operating statewide as well.
And that's my point into what can we control, and are we limited anyway through like even a partnership with the county, or is does it make the work greater and more robust? And that's why the question is there, because I think when we make these investments with limited dollars, that we want to make sure that we are getting enough information and the right information for us to be able to make some changes. I mean, I think most of the people who will comment on this will say, we already knew that, right? We've already been experiencing that. My families have been experiencing this, but the what's next, is very important.
Yeah, and I think that, what this study does, though, is that it documents the problem, it validates the problem and the issues, and it gives you a solid basis for moving forward. So perceptions and opinions are one thing, but we have done the work and did the statistical analysis to say that this is not happening by chance. So this is the beginning. It's not the end, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. It certainly gives you a foundation for further improvement.
And one final thought. I mean, the fact that Albemarle County, who I understand was part of funding this study?
No.
They weren't? Okay, well. Not yet. But it does include their jurisdiction. And so the fact that their Board of Supervisors is not holding a hearing on this is kind of sobering to me, because obviously a lot of folks who get wrapped up into our local criminal justice system is across these jurisdictional lines. So just for myself and the community, it's a question, how do we make this a bigger priority for the Board of Supervisors? I know we have new Commonwealth's attorney in the audience who has made criminal justice reform a significant priority, but how do we ensure that the Board of Supervisors, has that same level of urgency on it?
Supervisor Malik was at the conversation we had earlier today, and there's apparently some potential interest about doing a similar presentation before the jail board at some future date as well. So I think there's opportunities for that conversation to continue, that this isn't the only opportunity for us to have a public conversation. So I'm hopeful that in other settings, we'll have similar conversations.
Any other questions? Thank you.
So when will we know next steps? Like, what's the...
That's a good question. I do think we need a little bit of time to do some sort of debriefing and contemplation about what went right, what didn't go so right for us in terms of our own process. And then I've asked MGT to start to think about sort of monetizing each one of those sort of decisions that we've talked about, like how much would it really cost, where could the money come from. I think there are lots of things internally that we can move forward with, that we don't need to wait for the research and planning team to make any decisions about, or even need to pay somebody from outside to help us with. And so I would like us to spend some more time thinking about that, the sort of how we check in with the community about the answers to those questions as well. And so I'm happy to come back before you with some sort of suggestions about how we might move forward after I've had an opportunity to do some of that thinking and also talk to the planning and research team about it. But it would certainly be several months from now. But if you would like that, I can sort of work towards a target date, if that's helpful.
Several months before we could get an update about potential next steps, or?
Yeah, I'd like a couple months to do that reflection and the planning and checking in with the planning team. Doesn't have to be 5 months, but I like a couple.
So.
It's really hard to get that group of people together.
April.
Yeah, late April.
Okay.
Okay.
So could we add this for the second April meeting for an update?
Have on that?
Oh, you mean a council meeting?
Yes, the council. And then if we decide in between then that a work session is the direction we want to go, then we can plan a work session for that.
I'm just trying to remember how our work session, I can't remember how our planning went for that. It's not top of mind for me, how far out we were.
I can't remember the timelines either, but I know there's one on climate change housing, but I can't remember whether we scheduled one.
I think that was April.
There are ones scheduled for April and May, I believe.
Right, then we have February we already had planned, then March is our budget work sessions, and then we have one for April and May, and then so it would be June.
If you didn't choose to continue with the summer break.
Right, we had canceled.
Oh, that's right.
Okay, so then the April update here.
From her, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Can't wait.
Would you give us feedback if that isn't feasible,
Yeah. Okay.
once you've checked in with?
Okay. Sure.
All right.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. All right, any other business?
Are we all set with the next steps for our strategic planning process? Do we have enough alignment for you to move forward?
I think so.
Okay, just making sure. So we'll just start setting up individual meetings and,
Did you have feedback? You didn't comment? Okay. All right. All right, so now we'll open up the matters by the public. Is there anyone who would like to speak?
Good evening, my name is Jeffrey Fogel. I live in Belmont here in the city. I want to comment on the DMC report that you've received. Several things. First off, when we say disparity, you know what that is? The real word for that is racism. Why do we always have to use euphemisms to talk about things? Even in the name of this body, the disproportionate minority contact with the adult criminal justice system is preposterous. The problem is not that it's been delayed a year. The problem is it's been delayed 150 years. And let's be clear about what's happened. People have gone to jail for lengthy times because they are black. Their lives have been destroyed. Their families' lives have been destroyed. A community has suffered extremely under this kind of oppression. And the people running the system, some of whom are here tonight, knew this as well as anybody in the community knew it. They just had to look and see who was coming through the doors. And they didn't do anything about it. I've been fighting for this study since 2011. The city refused to come up with any money to do this study. It only did it when it got $100,000 from the state to do this study. But there are, first off, I thought that the analysis was excellent. Of course, I'm no statistician and I can't speak to that. But what really disappointed me was the recommendations, none of which speak to the issue that was supposed to be addressed. How do we reduce disproportionality and disparity? Now, everything that's been recommended is a good idea, a nice idea, and will be helpful to everybody in the criminal justice system. But it's not going to address the problem that we were trying to address, which is race. You don't see anything in those list of recommendations where the word race applies, except perhaps for more diversity in the police department? And do we know whether or not increase in the diversity in the police department actually results in less disparity? Have we heard that? That's my understanding. It's not really. Well, where are our experts telling us that this is what we should do when it doesn't really solve the problem? Tell us that we should have cultural sensitivity sessions for the police. We know that doesn't work. And it makes it suspect, every recommendation that's been made here, even while the basic work that was done to analyze the system was done so well. And by the way, this is not so unusual. This is the essence of equal protection law under the 14th Amendment. You must show similarly situated people are being treated differently. And that simple proposition, which is what focuses every equal protection case, is what was done in this case and done well from what I can tell. And therefore, you can rely on the results of the study and the analysis, but these recommendations are not going to get you anywhere. And we can identify people. Let's start with the institution that we do control, the police department. We know, or they know, every officer who's made every arrest during the same period of time. And they know the race of the person who was arrested. So we can start looking at the officers who have the greatest disparity in their arrest records. Now, that's not a genius idea, but the question is, why couldn't that idea have come out of MGT? What was the problem? Because that addresses the police department, and you don't seem to want to address the police department. You say you've got to identify the entity that's responsible at each stage, and in the end, you don't do it. Now, it's obvious if you sit down and figure it out. Yes, this is the judges, this is the prosecutor, this is the magistrate, and this is the police department. But it wasn't done in the report as it was promised in the beginning of the report. So those are some very brief. I've been through this 3 or 4 times already. I've read it, and I have a long history of working in these areas as well. And I'm happy to participate, as we were precluded from participating by this planning commission. And it sounds like there's not going to be any further opportunity for people in the community. I sent a list of questions to Kaki that came out of this. She said you'll have an opportunity sometime in the future to get an answer to those questions. I'm wondering when.
Okay. Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
So, Harold Foley, city resident, organizer for LAJC. It's really funny that this report comes out, and I'm going to talk about the CRB, because if this report had came out in July, well, we had a different CRB in July, because the stuff that they recommended was pulled out of the original CRB. Data person, transparency, accountability. All that was pulled out of the original CRB. If you don't believe me, go read it. I guess what I'm saying is, how can we revisit it to make sure that it does happen, right? And I know you said we're going to give them a chance, right? The CRB that's coming. But they don't have a chance because they can't do anything.
But, so you can stop his time so and make sure you have, because I just want to interject here just to make sure that if the board is, we're interviewing for the board right now, and we want the board to help hire the executive director. And then we're saying the board and the executive director together can tell us what else they need and present that. So there was never not, you can never present this. That's not what we said.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't.
And so that person would be hired by the person who would be charged of supervising them at that point, which would be the executive director.
Who's in charge with figuring out the data?
No, the executive director would say that this is the person we need and make that recommendation.
6 months
It's
down
not
the road.
off the table, but you would propose who hiring that person.
You're right, the executive director, but what I'm saying is the original bylaws had everything, every step that they needed to do to make sure it was proper. The bylaws that was passed took a lot out of the original bylaws that make it watered down. That's exactly what I'm saying.
And I hear you with that, but the new board, and then if the new board and the ED come before us and say, this is what we need, these are gonna be the bylaws that we're going to follow, and this is the next step. If we then say you can't do that, then I think your argument and the arguments that you all have been making will at that point be valid. I think we're on track. There were a lot of reasons that what happened with the CRB occurred. And it was a very exhausting process.
It was.
Right? But at no point did anyone say that this is final. And I think that you all keep speaking to it as if that is final.
Well, I mean, and this is the thing, and Nakai, you know too, Mayor Nakai, you know too.
Nakai's fine.
With what goes on with the city council, they pass stuff and say, okay, we're gonna let them to do whatever, right? It doesn't end up being like that. And the reason why I think we fighting so hard, because we see things like the Human Rights Commission and what happens, right? They suppose they came back and it's like, okay, we're gonna fix whatever is happening with the Human Rights Commission, and it never happened. And so I think what it is that we, the people, see that sometimes city council vote on things, but just leave it like it is. And what we felt like was that city council just voted on something to say, okay, we got something done. And that's what the people feel like. That's why we are up here all the time pushing for the original bylaws how they are, right? We can talk about the data person. That's cool. But it's still other stuff that's missing out of the bylaws that is not. Like, who gonna actually sit down with these folks and say, okay, this is the original bylaw? It's not gonna happen.
Yeah, so no, but they have access to all of that information, and someone sent in information to say that the original documents they couldn't access, and that was fixed, right? So that they could access it.
The original bylaws, y'all have it on the website?
Is it there?
Everything from the original CRB is on the website.
The original bylaws.
Also, something, we started the interviews today. One of the first people we interviewed talked about changes that they would recommend being made in the bylaws. Nobody in that room said you can't make any changes. I know you didn't say it to me, but I watched you the last meeting. You were frustrated because you thought that someone might not get an interview.
Yeah.
We had already made the selection of who would be interviewed, and I think now you see that person received an interview.
No.
I mean, I just think that some things, just because it may not be stated, and I understand why there is the mistrust among the government body that sit, and I tell us all the time, we haven't done enough to earn the trust, but I hope that over time you see the actions and what they result in, and that you all will begin to understand. Again, if we come back and start telling the board that's in place and the ED, no, they can't do things, then I think what we're gonna hear, we deserve to hear, but I don't think that'll be the case.
Well, I think one of the things that you have to understand, and I think you know, the People's Coalition like to keep politics or politicians accountable for their words. And so we're gonna continue to come through the DMC stuff, through the criminal justice stuff.
And you should.
And we're gonna keep coming strong to make sure that it does happen. And we're gonna try our best to help through the way of criminal justice issues in Charlottesville. I don't know about Albemarle County because that's a different animal, but I know in Charlottesville, I'm not gonna come up here because that's cliche to say I knew this stuff was happening in the black community, because myself, I am a former incarcerated person, right? So I understand how bad the system is. But I also want to make sure that my voice is heard and the people's voice is heard about, keeping things accountable. So thank y'all so much. But like I said, People's Coalitions are going to always be at this podium.
And I think you should.
And I will say, I think I can see where there are gaps in this process that could cause a lack of trust or doubt, given the history of the city and the fact that obviously we as a council do not hire the ED. my understanding is the board does not hire the ED. So there's no guarantees at any point that, it's the city governments are bureaucracy. Bureaucracies have certain dynamics, and I could see it playing out in a way where while it's technically possible that it could have gone in a different direction, the likelihood is that it doesn't. But that's just, I know that's an ongoing conversation we'll have. But I share some of the concern about whether we'll actually get a product that matches this, even though we technically could, just looking at the history of the city.
If I could add one thing to what Jeff said, I would also like to encourage the people who are in positions of leadership, and that's largely police chiefs, but also to some extent Commonwealth's attorneys, to have an eye out for the individual officers. I mean, I have my own list of officers who are more likely to arrest somebody for driving while black, for example. And some of them, Jeff, you and I have shared some clients together in that respect. But I don't know of any way to really get that information to decision makers who would then say, you're right. That's a person we need to look at more carefully. I don't know how you would get enough data, because I tried this once before in a case about 15 years ago, tried to get data on a particular officer, and I couldn't get it as a litigant, as an attorney for a litigant. Maybe there's a way to get it internally in some way to keep track of who's stopping who and for what, and who's using what particular arguments or rationale. I've said before, I think one of the things that we do in Virginia is that, I smell a marijuana in the car, and boom, you get to search the car and things go from there. To his credit, the last case I had like that with Joe Platania, we worked something out that was nowhere near as onerous as it should have been, as it could have been. And so there is some room for working on some things like that. But that's the sort of thing where I wish that we had a good way that I knew of for well-informed complaints to get to the right people where somebody could do something. And I don't know what that is, but.
Do you all know the answer to that question?
Oh,
Okay, just asking.
That was one of the things that we wanted to look at, but, we need to get access to personnel records and race and ethnicity of officers. I mean, there's a lot of things that we wanted to do that we were not able to do for this particular time. But it is possible to do that type of analysis, if we have access to the data.
So that was one of the things that was put on the maybe next time list, Khaki? Is it?
Well, I mean, I think,
Could you? Yeah. No.
I think we certainly started this study trying to look at systems without an eye towards any kind of punitive sort of search or decision-making process. And so if we identified flawed or concerned decision-making processes, we wanted to know more. We wanted people who were responsible for those systems to pay attention to the data and take action around them for sure. But the idea that we were sort of searching for bad actors within the process was certainly not a motivation for any part of the study. And so I think it would be a radical shift for us to move that direction. It's not impossible, but it would be a radical shift for us to focus away from trying to influence the sort of larger systems to try to focus on bad actors and individuals in each one of those decision-making points. And so, I'm struggling with the sort of focus on individual accountability versus system accountability. And I know that that's not so easy to parse out, but we certainly started with a system approach and not based on trying to search out individuals.
But the
Because I think we
system
keep
is
hearing that it's a
upheld by those individual actions.
And the system is flawed as well. And so there's flawed humans inside flawed systems. And so I think it's a larger question about how do you pursue the next phase? Are we interested in, I think there's the idea of sort of searching for individual sort of police officer actions is fraught with a lot of difficulty, and I can't imagine that we would find a sample study that sort of looks at individual police behavior as opposed to sort of police department or magistrate or probation sort of behavior by itself as opposed to individuals in that system. And I think it's a little bit dangerous for us to sort of be looking for individuals because it does neglect the idea that the system itself is that also is flawed policy and flawed sort of system approaches that also need that kind of course correction. So I'm not sure what we should be doing when we go forward, but certainly we did not approach it by this idea that we were having a punitive or accountability-based approach for individuals.
Thank you. And I think my just comment there and issues there, I remember when I was working with City of Promise, which one of the jobs I worked myself out of rather quickly, but when we were doing the community survey there, two of the questions that I wanted to ask was where you were receiving services, and a sub-question was rate that service, and who were you receiving those services from? Because if you work in the system, then you hear consistent themes about this social worker, this teacher, and that was the next question. What teachers made you feel valued? Who didn't? Like names, right? And even then, my two questions didn't get added. But people did not want the naming of names. And so the difference between what we were willing to do here and what you go to Harlem and visit Harlem Children's Zone and they say we are having the success, which City of Promises was modeled after, because we control every aspect, including the people who come in contact with our kids and our families, versus talking about fixing something at the system level and not taking into the equation that the system didn't create itself. The system was created by people, and people are perpetuating those behaviors. And I know that I have not been a favorite of any job I've worked at because I have been consistently saying your actions, your behavior are leading to these issues that we're saying we're working to undo. Like you can't undo them. And people have a hard time receiving that. So I get it. I do hear you, but I don't know how you do this work without, like how you fix the problem without doing that. Because what we hear now is the school system is failing when my kids have gone through the school system and they've done well. So there are some teachers who are able to do a great job with certain, but we don't hear that. Because the teachers who are not doing well, the administrators are not doing well, are able to hide behind this system, and then the good teachers get thrown into the equation of as if they were part of the teachers who are not doing well, because we just refuse to do that level of work. And maybe we don't plaster their names on the side of Dairy Central beside the cow, but there is a conversation about with them, with their department heads, with the city manager about who, what, and what needs to be done as a result of that.
And
Yeah, we're not even willing to look at that information internally. Right? We're not even willing to compile it, but at the same time, we are willing to allow families to continue suffering and just in a injustice system, right, that doesn't work like for them, that takes them away from their families. We're willing to have kids who don't grow up with their parents, and we know that it's not just about their behaviors, right?
And I would just briefly, I would note this conversation might be slightly different from that, but one of the recommendations, reading directly, is, quote, another step to consider would be to disclose past police misconduct. She also discusses the efforts of the Philadelphia and Texas district attorneys to institute a practice of documenting officers who had a history of being an unreliable witness, civil rights violations, using excessive force, biased behavior, lying on duty, or giving false testimony.
And I think I've heard that enough time to be comfortable saying who that probably came from, but I don't know because I didn't write the report. But that probably came from a staff member, am I correct?
That's just one of our recommendations, another step to consider. You know, to disclose, you know, past police misconduct.
That's right.
All right, is there anyone else who would like to speak? Oh, and Joy was up.
Katrina Turner. I just want to say that the initial Civilian Review Board spent over a year writing these bylaws. And for one, for City Council to just look at it for a couple of months and just gut everything that we did for a year was totally wrong. Two, you know, to put all this work on the new Civilian Review Board instead of just passing what we did. If they had anything to change, if they didn't like what was in the bylaws, they could have changed it. As you said, that they're allowed to change the bylaws, but what you all did to our work is shameful. It really is. And if you say that you are looking to help our community and what we're going through out here with the police, that was not, you did wrong by gutting that CRB and not giving it any teeth. Why gut it right now, and then when the new CRB comes, they have to go through everything we went through, and then how long is it gonna take for the new CRB to get up and running? There's people out here right now who need help. We don't need the CRB to get to running, what, in October, November? We need that CRB right now. With this report that just came out, people have been complaining about the police for so long. What is gonna happen? What's gonna happen with our complaints? That we have told you what the police have did to our family members or to us. What is going to happen with those complaints? Are you going to come back and look at the complaints now? And as I asked, just like looking at the police that are doing this, that's what I have asked for also. Why can't there be an investigation on these police that we are complaining about? Is what I want to know. Why can't they go back on to see if they had any complaints on them? This is something that I know was not done in my complaint. I know for a fact it was not done. A lot of things were not done. Everything that Michael just mentioned about the police, the bias, everything that he just mentioned is a complaint that I have on those two police officers. Every single thing that he just said, but nothing happened. What's going to happen to these innocent people that have been thrown in jail because of these police out here? What's supposed to happen? What can we do? We know now that we've already known, but we know now that they have actually been targeting us. We've come to you and told you how they've targeted people. What are you going to do about that? How can you come back and help us with what we have come to you about, the police, when you just found the truth out? They're targeting our people. So what can we do? What can y'all do for this to stop?
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Joy Johnson, and I reside at 802A Hardy Drive. A couple of things, I have three things to say real quickly. One, I have spoken to Mr. Richardson about that park that they're thinking about putting up at 8 and Hardy. And again, I'm saying, I don't care what kind of RFP y'all have out there, it's a bad idea to put a park right there at the corner and outreach was not really done to the West Haven community. It was an ice cream social to tell people about that. But if you're gonna send out flyers about an ice cream social, the only people gonna show up for the ice cream are the kids. And so I just want to put that on there to say no park. I see them, a lot of activities happening, like where they're doing survey. I think that's the worst thing you can do, and you have to consider the people who live in the 808, 802 and the 806 building. All right, the other observation I have, one of the things I learned real early on into my activism is that I had to look at the root cause of what's happening. Racism is a big part of it, but also there is money. Money is attached to people being in prison. Everybody makes money when our folks are incarcerated. I am the parent of sons who were incarcerated, and some of the places that they put our loved ones are in the boondocks, where you have to go up, you have to travel on roads, you have to have canteen, you have to have all this stuff. So everybody is making money. At the end of the day, Paula Lark, when she came here to spoke, she said, you need to look at the institutional racism, and that is City Hall, and it's also the prisons. The prisons are private, and they are making money. Even sending money to put on your family's books, you either have to send it to Des Moines, Iowa, and it takes weeks before they can get it, or guess how they get it quickly? Western Union. Making money. And then when the phone calls, they're making money. Again, at the end of the day, it's about making money. Your study should include that, is to look at the prism and who is making money. And what I learned early on is that that's one of the biggest commodity on Wall Street. Biggest commodity on Wall Street. So as I was sitting back there thinking about all of that, this study, we had this before. We have talked about this before. Jeff has raised holy hell in meetings about this report. So I am with the mayor about, we know these things, so what else are you going to do? And then the last thing I want to say, I've been going through this implicit bias training. I think it needs to be a mandatory. It needs to be mandatory that city staff and people who serve others go through implicit bias training, because it does have a way. It does affect how you treat people and what you do for people. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
Hello, Council, Mayor. My name's Brad Slocum. I live off of JPA. I didn't come planning to speak, so pardon me if I flit around a little bit, but I think it's really critical to address a couple of points from some of the speakers in the earlier public comment period, and then in the later comments while we're out here calling things by what they are. The references by an earlier speaker to ideas that it's natural that certain people commit crimes more often or something like that, that's racist stuff. We have to call it that. It's false. It's wrong. To perpetuate it. On a similar note, when you hear George Soros and global conspiracy, that's anti-Semitism. We got to call it that. And so going back to the idea of these things being perpetuated by individuals and systems, just coming from the general anti-racist and anti-fascist context, there's a lot of controversy around the tactic, but doxing does work. When you call someone's job and tell them, hey, someone's promoting race war online, do you like employing this person? That person doesn't generally stay employed at that place for very long. And so just analogizing to the idea of oversight of people who we give the power to perpetuate violence, change entire people's lives, and rip apart communities. Maybe there should be some consideration giving to identifying the people to put a stop to the behavior. Then just going back to the previous speaker's comments about the Confederate Dixie culture and similar things like that, part of the reason I wanted to call out the racism and anti-Semitism separately is because, particularly in the context of, say, the gun rally in Richmond a couple weeks ago, white nationalists, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, not all the same. Happy to ally frequently. We experienced what happens when we allow those overlaps to go unaddressed and don't call things by their names and don't listen to the people who are bringing the concerns forward and naming individuals, naming specific parts of the system. So when we talk about police violence, disparities and disproportionality, I think it's worth keeping in mind the Dixie culture, the rebel yell, the other parts of our, maybe non-state system, but that perpetuate the problems that we're struggling to address decades and centuries later. So just some things to reflect on based on the other comments. So thank you for your time.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak? No? All right. Meeting adjourned.
We never voted.